The banging on the door started at midnight, and Alara Voss knew before she even reached the top of the stairs that something terrible had arrived at her home. She stood frozen in her nightclothes, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, listening to the heavy fists strike the front door, again and again. Her father's voice came next, shaking, pleading with someone through the wood. She had never heard him sound like that before. Henry Voss was a proud man, or at least he pretended to be one. He was not a man who begged. She crept down the stairs slowly, gripping the railing, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The hallway light was off, but moonlight spilled through the window beside the door, and in that pale light she saw 3 shadows standing outside, tall and still, waiting with the kind of patience that frightened her more than shouting would have. "Open the door, Henry," a deep voice said calmly. "You know why we are here." Her father's hand trembled on the lock. When the door finally opened, 3 men stepped into the house without being invited. They moved like they owned the place already, their eyes sweeping over the furniture, the paintings on the wall, the old clock in the corner, as if they were counting everything and finding all of it worthless. The man in front was broad-shouldered, with cold gray eyes and a scar running along his jaw. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You were given 6 months," he said. "You have had 9. My patience has limits, and so does my master's." "I told you," Henry stammered, backing away. "I need more time. The business will turn around. I have a plan." "You have had 4 plans," the man interrupted. "Each one has failed. Money does not appear because you hope for it, Henry. It appears because you pay what you owe." Alara stood at the bottom of the stairs, unseen for a moment, watching her father shrink in front of these strangers. She had known, in a vague and frightened way, that her father had money troubles. She had seen the unopened envelopes piling on his desk, the phone calls he took in whispers behind closed doors, the way he flinched whenever the doorbell rang. But she had never imagined it was like this. She had never imagined men like these, standing in her living room at midnight, speaking about her father's failures, as if they were reading from a ledger. "Please," Henry said, his voice cracking, "give me until the end of the month. I can find something. I can sell the house." "The house is not enough," the scarred man said. "It was never going to be enough. You know that. You knew that when you signed the papers." Henry's eyes darted toward the stairs, and that was when the scarred man noticed her. "Well," he said, his gaze settling on Alara, with an interest that made her skin crawl. "Is this her?" Henry's face went pale. "No. No. Leave her out of this. This has nothing to do with her." "It has everything to do with her," the man said, stepping closer to the stairs. "You offered her yourself, Henry, 3 weeks ago, in a moment of desperation. Did you think we would forget? Did you think we would not come to collect?" Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her. She looked at her father, waiting for him to deny it, to laugh it off, to tell these men they were mistaken. Instead, he stood there with his mouth open and no words coming out, and in that silence, she understood the truth. He had offered her. He had used her as a bargaining chip to buy himself more time, and he had never told her. "Father," she whispered, "what is he talking about?" Henry would not meet her eyes. "I did not mean it," he said weakly, though whether he was speaking to her or to the men in the room, she could not tell. "I was not thinking clearly. I was desperate. I never thought they would actually—" "You do not get to take it back," the scarred man said. "A debt is a debt, and a promise is a promise. Your daughter is now part of what you owe." Alara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand straight. She had spent her whole life being told to be quiet, to be agreeable, to let her father handle the difficult things. She was done being quiet. "I am not a piece of property," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "You cannot simply take a person to pay a debt. This is not how the world works." The scarred man smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "In your world, perhaps not. But you no longer belong only to that world, little one. Your father's debt is not owed to ordinary men. It is owed to the Alpha King of the Northern Pax, and in his world, a promise made is a promise kept, whether or not it is convenient for you." The Alpha King. Alara had heard the name before, whispered in news reports and rumors, spoken of the way people spoke of storms and natural disasters, something powerful and distant that could destroy everything in its path, if it ever turned its attention toward you. She had never imagined it would turn toward her. "You cannot be serious," she said, looking between the men and her father. "Someone like that does not simply collect people like unpaid bills." "You would be surprised what he collects," the man said. "Pack your things. We leave within the hour." "No." Henry finally found his voice, though it shook badly. "Please, there must be another way. Take the house. Take everything I have. Just not her." "You have nothing left to take," the scarred man said, his patience thinning. "Your accounts are empty. Your properties are mortgaged 3 times over. The only thing of value you have left standing in this house is her, and you already offered her freely." "This is not a negotiation, Henry. This is a collection." Alara watched her father crumble, watched him sink into a chair and put his face in his hands, and she felt something break inside her, some last thread of belief that he would protect her no matter what. He had gambled away the business his own father built, gambled away the house, gambled away every safety net that should have existed between her and a moment like this, and in the end, when he ran out of things to lose, he had offered her. She thought about running. For one wild second, she imagined bolting for the back door, disappearing into the night, finding some way to vanish before these men could take her anywhere. But she looked at the 2 men flanking the door, and understood immediately how foolish that thought was. There was no outrunning men who moved the way they did, who stood so still and so certain, as if they had never once failed to catch what they were sent to catch. "Give me a moment," she said instead, lifting her chin. "If I am to be taken somewhere, I would like to change into proper clothing, and gather a few things. You would not want to bring your king a prisoner who looks as though she was dragged from her bed." The scarred man studied her for a long moment, something flickering behind his cold eyes that might have been surprise, or perhaps respect. "You have 10 minutes, he said. "Marcus will go with you." One of the other men, younger and quieter, stepped forward. Alara turned without another word and walked up the stairs, aware of his footsteps behind her, aware that she was no longer alone, even in her own bedroom. She closed the door as far as he would allow, changed quickly into warm clothes, and packed a small bag with the few things that mattered to her. A photograph of her mother who had passed years earlier, a worn book she had read 100 times, a simple silver bracelet that had belonged to her grandmother. She caught her reflection in the mirror before she left the room, and almost did not recognize the calm on her own face. Inside, she was shaking apart. But she had learned long ago that fear, once you let people see it, became a weapon they could use against you. She had watched her father fall apart in front of these men, watched how it only made them more certain of their power. She would not give them that same satisfaction. When she came back downstairs, her father was still sitting in the chair, staring at nothing. She stopped in front of him. "Look at me," she said. Slowly, he raised his eyes to hers, and what she saw there was not the strength of a father trying to protect his child. It was the emptiness of a man who had already given up. "I forgive you," she said, though the words tasted strange in her mouth, half true and half something she was saying only to give herself courage. "But I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your life. Remember what you traded away, and remember that I was the one who had to pay for it." He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. She turned away from him and walked toward the door, where the scarred man was waiting, with something like approval in his expression. "Bold," he said. "That will either serve you well where you are going, or it will not serve you at all." "We shall see," Alara replied, and stepped out into the cold night air. A dark vehicle waited at the curb, sleek and unmarked, the kind of car that belonged to people who did not need to advertise their power, because everyone already knew who they were. Marcus opened the back door for her, and she slid inside without hesitation, refusing to let her hands shake as she buckled the seatbelt. Through the window, she watched her childhood home shrink into the darkness as the car pulled away, the porch light still burning, her father's silhouette frozen in the doorway, unmoving, unable even to say goodbye. She did not cry. She promised herself she would not cry, not in front of these men, not for a father who had sold her to save himself. The scarred man settled into the front seat and glanced back at her through the mirror. "You should know," he said, "where you are going." The Alpha King does not often deal in matters this small. Debts like your father's are usually handled by lesser men. The fact that he chose to collect this one personally tells me he is either very bored or very interested in something none of us yet understand. And which do you think it is? Elara asked, keeping her voice level. The man's eyes lingered on her a moment longer before returning to the road. I have not decided yet, he said, but I suspect we will all find out soon enough. The car sped through empty streets, carrying her farther and farther from everything she had ever known, toward a fate she could not yet imagine, and toward a man whose name alone made grown men lower their eyes. Elara pressed her palm flat against the cool window glass, steadying her breath, and told herself, over and over, that whatever waited for her at the end of this road, she would not arrive there broken. She would arrive there standing. The drive stretched on for hours, the city lights fading behind them, until there was nothing but dark highway and distant mountains rising like shadows against the night sky. Elara watched the landscape change, watched trees grow taller and wilder, watched the ordinary world she had always lived in disappear behind a border she did not know existed until she crossed it. Somewhere along that road, a checkpoint appeared, manned by guards who looked at the car with quiet recognition and waved it through without a single question. Whoever these men worked for, his authority reached far beyond anything she had imagined. No one spoke for a long while. Elara used the silence to steady her thoughts, to prepare herself for whatever came next, though she could not begin to guess what that would be. She thought of every story she had ever heard about the Alpha King, stories that ranged from admiration to terror, stories of a ruler who had built peace among packs that once tore each other apart, and stories of a man who was said to be untouchable, unreachable, and unfeeling. She did not know which version of him she would meet, but she knew, with a strange and steady certainty settling into her chest, that whoever he was, she would not let him see her afraid. Not tonight, not ever, if she could help it. The car began to slow as the road curved upward into the hills, and in the far distance, past the tree line, she caught her first glimpse of towering stone walls, lit faintly by torchlight, a fortress that looked as though it belonged to another century entirely. Her breath caught in her throat. Whatever waited behind those walls, her old life had already ended the moment those men walked through her front door. Her new one was about to begin. The car climbed higher, following a narrow road cut into the hillside, and the fortress grew larger with every passing minute until it swallowed the entire horizon. Elara had seen pictures of old castles in books, remnants of a world long gone, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of one still standing, still breathing, still very much alive with purpose. Lights burned in high windows. Figures moved along the outer walls, patrolling with a discipline that reminded her of soldiers rather than guards. This was not a museum. This was a seat of power. You will want to sit up straight, the scarred man said from the front seat, glancing at her once more in the mirror. First impressions matter here, more than you might think. Elara said nothing, but she did straighten her spine, smoothing the front of her jacket with hands that she forced to stay steady. She would not give this man, or anyone waiting beyond those walls, the satisfaction of watching her arrive looking small. The car slowed as it approached an enormous iron gate, taller than any structure she had ever stood beneath. Two guards stepped forward from the shadows, their eyes briefly sweeping the vehicle before recognition passed between them and the driver. Words were exchanged, low and quick, words she could not hear through the glass, and then the gate began to open with a slow, grinding sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Beyond the gate lay a wide courtyard, lit by rows of lanterns, their flames flickering against dark stone walls. Elara pressed her fingers lightly against the door handle, an old habit, a small comfort in feeling that escape was theoretically possible, even when she knew it was not. The car rolled to a stop near a wide set of stone steps, leading up to towering double doors. Marcus opened her door before she could reach for it herself. "We are here," he said, his voice quieter than before, almost gentle, as though some part of him understood what she was about to face. "It would be wise to walk in with your head high. The pack respects strength. They have little patience for anything else." "I intend to," Elara said, stepping out into the cold night air. The courtyard smelled of wood smoke and pine, and somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the low sound of a horn, a signal perhaps, announcing that a debt had arrived to be paid. She followed Marcus and the scarred man up the stone steps, her small bag clutched tightly in one hand, her chin lifted despite the tremor she could feel building beneath her calm exterior. At the top of the steps, the great doors opened, before they even reached them, swung wide by two more guards, who bowed their heads slightly to the scarred man, but did not look directly at Alara at all, as though she were something too insignificant, or too uncertain, to acknowledge. Inside, the hall stretched wide and high, lit by enormous chandeliers that cast warm golden light across polished stone floors. Tapestries hung along the walls, depicting scenes of wolves running through forests, of battles long since ended, of crowns passed from one generation to the next. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest tighten, beautiful in the way that power often was, meant to remind anyone who entered exactly how small they were in comparison. A tall woman approached them from a side corridor, dressed in dark, elegant clothing, her expression unreadable. "This is the girl?" she asked, looking Alara over with the same assessing gaze the scarred man had used back in her father's living room. "This is her," the scarred man confirmed. "Henry Voss's daughter, the debt made flesh." The woman's eyes lingered on Alara a moment longer, something almost like curiosity passing behind them. "He will want to see her tonight then." He said as much when word reached him that the collection was complete. Alara's heart stumbled. "Tonight? Now?" "The Alpha King does not enjoy waiting," the woman said simply, as though that explained everything, as though patience were a luxury, reserved only for people far less important than the man she was about to meet. "Come with me." Alara glanced once at Marcus, who offered her the smallest, briefest nod, something that might have been meant as encouragement, though she could not be certain. Then she turned and followed the woman deeper into the fortress, her footsteps echoing against the stone floor, each step carrying her closer to the man whose name alone had been enough to make her father's hands shake, the man who now, apparently, owned her in every way that mattered, under whatever laws governed this hidden world. She thought of her mother, gone now for years, and wondered what she would say if she could see her daughter walking these halls. She thought of the house she had grown up in, the ordinary life she had taken for granted, the small worries that had once seemed so large before tonight had rearranged everything she understood about the world and her place within it. Fear tried to claw its way up her throat, and she pushed it back down with practiced determination. She had promised herself in that car, staring at her childhood home disappearing into the dark, that she would not arrive broken. She intended to keep that promise, whatever waited for her behind the next set of doors. The woman led her down a long corridor, lined with tall windows, moonlight spilling across the floor in silver strips. At the end of the corridor stood another set of doors, smaller than the ones at the entrance but somehow more intimidating, guarded by two men who straightened the moment they saw who approached. "Wait here," the woman instructed, gesturing to a bench set against the wall. "I will announce you when he is ready." Alara did not sit. She stood instead, back straight, hands folded in front of her, staring at those closed doors as though she could somehow see through them, to whatever waited on the other side. Her mind raced through everything she had heard about the Alpha King over the years, fragments of rumor and speculation that suddenly felt far too thin to prepare her for what was coming. Minutes passed, though it felt far longer, the silence in the corridor pressing against her ears, until she could hear her own heartbeat, steady and insistent, refusing to let her forget how frightened she truly was, beneath the calm she had built like armor around herself. She thought about the scarred man's words in the car, about how the Alpha King rarely handled matters this small personally, and wondered again what that might mean for her. Finally the doors opened, and the woman reappeared, her expression giving nothing away. "He will see you now," she said. "Remember where you are, and remember who you are speaking to." Alara lifted her chin one final time, drew in a slow breath, and stepped forward into whatever waited beyond those doors, carrying with her the last fragile pieces of the ordinary life she had left behind, and the quiet, stubborn resolve that no matter what happened next, she would not let this man see her shake. The room beyond the doors was nothing like she expected. She had imagined a throne room, cold and formal, filled with rows of watching eyes. Instead, she found a wide chamber with a high wooden ceiling, a fire burning in a massive stone hearth, and shelves lined with books that stretched from floor to ceiling along one entire wall. It looked less like a place of judgment, and more like a place where someone actually lived, and that unexpected detail unsettled her more than a throne room would have. A handful of people stood scattered around the edges of the room, dressed in dark, practical clothing, their postures alert in the way soldiers stood even at rest. None of them looked directly at her. All of their attention was fixed on the man seated near the fire, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of something amber-colored resting untouched in his hand. Ilara's first thought was that he did not look like a king at all. He wore no crown, no ceremonial robes, nothing that marked him as different from the men standing guard around him, except for the way every single person in that room seemed to orient themselves around him, the way the air itself seemed to bend toward where he sat, as if the whole building existed simply to hold him. He was younger than she expected, though age was difficult to guess given the stillness in his face, a stillness that suggested he had learned long ago to give nothing away. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers across the room, were a pale gray that reminded her of storm clouds gathering before violence. There was nothing warm in that gaze. There was only calculation, sharp and immediate, sweeping over her the way a merchant might assess a piece of merchandise delivered slightly late. She made herself hold that gaze without flinching, though her pulse hammered so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. "So," he said, his voice low and unhurried, carrying easily across the distance between them, without any need to be raised. "This is the debt." "This is Ilara Voss," the woman who had escorted her said, stepping slightly to the side. "Henry Voss's daughter." The Alpha King studied her for a long moment, and Ilara forced herself to stand perfectly still under that scrutiny, refusing to shift her weight, refusing to look away, refusing to give him even the smallest sign that his stare unsettled her as deeply as it did. "Leave us," he said finally, and though his tone remained calm, every person in the room moved instantly, filing out through side doors without a word of protest or hesitation. Within moments, Ilara found herself alone with him, the fire crackling softly, the heavy doors closing behind the last departing guard, with a sound that felt far too final. For a long stretch of silence, he simply looked at her, and she looked back, neither of them speaking, the fire popping occasionally in the hearth, the only sound in the room. She had expected questions immediately, demands, perhaps even threats. Instead, he seemed content to study her, the way one might study a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit the picture on the box. "Sit," he said eventually, gesturing to the chair across from his own. "I would rather stand," Ilara replied, and immediately wondered if she had made a mistake, if defiance this early would cost her more than she could afford to pay. But something in his expression shifted, the faintest flicker of interest crossing those storm-gray eyes. "As you wish," he said, setting his glass down on the small table beside him. "Do you know why you are here, Ilara Voss?" "My father owed you a debt," she said, "and apparently, he offered me as payment, though he never once thought to ask whether I agreed to be offered." "Fathers rarely do," the Alpha King said, something dark passing briefly behind his eyes before it vanished again. "Do you know who I am?" "I know what people call you," she said carefully, "the Alpha King of the Northern Packs. I know that men fear you enough to hand over their own children rather than face your collectors again. And what do you think of that?" Ilara considered the question for a moment, choosing her words with care, aware that whatever she said in this room might shape everything that followed. "I think it is a cruel way to run anything, whether it is a kingdom or a business. I think men who inspire that kind of fear rarely stop to wonder what it costs the people caught beneath it." She expected anger. She expected, at the very least, some flicker of offense at being spoken to so plainly by a girl delivered to him as payment for another man's failures. Instead, something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Careful," he said. "Most people in your position choose their words far more gently." "Most people in my position are probably too afraid to choose their words at all," Ilara said. "I decided, somewhere on the drive here, that I would rather speak honestly and face whatever consequences come from it, than spend whatever time I have in this place pretending to be someone I am not." He rose from his chair then, slow and deliberate, and crossed the room toward her with an unhurried grace that reminded her, despite herself, of something predatory, something that had never once needed to rush, because it had never once needed to chase anything it truly wanted. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze, far enough that she did not feel immediately threatened, though every instinct in her body remained on alert. "Tell me something," he said, studying her face with the same unreadable intensity he had shown from across the room. "Every person who has ever stood where you are standing now has trembled in front of me. Some have cried, some have begged, a few have even fainted, which I confess, I have never quite understood, given that I had not yet said a single threatening word to any of them. And I am supposed to be different? You have not trembled once, he said, ignoring her question. You have not begged, and you have not cried, though I imagine you have very good reason to do both tonight. So tell me, Alara Voss, and tell me honestly, because I will know if you lie. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, curiosity breaking briefly through that carefully maintained stillness, something that looked almost like genuine confusion, as though he had encountered a problem he could not immediately solve. Why are you not afraid of me? The question hung in the air between them, and Alara felt her carefully constructed composure waver for just a moment, surprised not by the question itself, but by the sincerity behind it, the sense that he truly wanted to understand, rather than simply testing her the way everyone else in her life seemed determined to do. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, choosing her words carefully, aware that whatever she said next might determine everything about the path her life would take from this moment forward. Who says I am not afraid? She finally replied, her voice steady, despite the trembling she could feel building somewhere beneath her ribs. Perhaps I am terrified. Perhaps I have simply learned, over many years of watching my father fall apart in front of stronger men, that showing fear rarely changes the outcome. It only ever seems to make things worse. The Alpha King studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind those pale gray eyes, and for the first time since she had walked into that room, Alara had the distinct impression that she had genuinely surprised him. That, he said slowly, is not the answer I expected. What answer did you expect? I am not entirely certain, he admitted, and there was something almost human in the honesty of that admission, a crack in the careful armor he wore, as easily as most men wore their clothing. Perhaps that is what interests me most. He turned away from her then, walking back toward the fire, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, with her heart still pounding, and her mind racing to understand what had just happened. What it meant, that a man with a reputation built on fear had just admitted, however briefly, that she had confused him. You will stay here, he said, his back still turned to her, his voice returning to the calm, commanding tone he had used at the very beginning. Not as a prisoner, and not as property, despite how you arrived here tonight. You will stay as a guest, for now, until I decide what your father's debt truly requires of you. And if I refuse? He glanced back at her over his shoulder, and this time there was no amusement in his expression, only something quiet and serious that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. You will not refuse, he said. Not because I will force you, but because you have nowhere else to go, and because some part of you already understands that whatever waits for you here is far more interesting than whatever waited for you back home. Alara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she would find a way to leave this place the very first chance she had. But standing there in that fire-lit room, facing a man whose very presence seemed to rearrange the air around her, she found she could not summon the words to deny what he had said, because some small, unwelcome part of her feared it might already be true. Rest tonight, he said, moving toward a bell pull near the wall. We will speak again tomorrow, and perhaps by then, you will have decided whether to keep surprising me, or whether tonight was simply an exception, born of shock and exhaustion. The doors opened moments later, and the tall woman who had escorted her earlier reappeared, waiting silently to lead her away. Alara hesitated at the threshold, glancing back once at the Alpha King, who had returned to his chair by the fire, his gaze already distant, already lost in thoughts she could not begin to guess. What is your name? She asked suddenly, realizing no one had actually told her, that she had spent the entire encounter speaking to a title rather than a person. He looked up, and for just a moment, something almost like surprise crossed his face again, as though the question itself was unusual, as though very few people in his life had ever thought to ask something so simple. Cale, he said. Cale Draven. Alara, she replied, though he already knew her name. Just Alara. Not a debt, not property, just a person, whether you choose to remember that or not. Something flickered behind his eyes again, brief and unreadable, before he inclined his head slightly, almost like a small concession. Good night, Alara, he said. Sleep well, if you can." She turned and followed the woman out of the room, her legs finally beginning to shake now that his eyes were no longer on her, now that the enormous weight of his attention had lifted enough for her body to remember how frightened she truly was, beneath the calm she had forced herself to wear. But beneath that fear, something else had taken root as well, something small and stubborn and impossible to name. A flicker of curiosity about the man who had looked at her not as a debt to be collected, but as a question he suddenly needed answered. Whatever came next, she understood now that her life inside these walls would not be simple, and it would certainly not be predictable. As she walked down the long corridor toward whatever room had been prepared for her, Alara found herself wondering, for the first time since the men had broken into her home hours earlier, whether surviving this place might require something far more complicated than simply staying strong. It might require understanding a man who did not seem to understand himself. The woman leading her through the corridors finally spoke once they were well away from the fire-lit chamber, her voice quieter now, less formal than it had been earlier. "I am Della," she said. "I manage the household here. If you need anything during your stay, you may ask for me directly." "Does everyone who arrives here get a personal introduction to the household manager?" Alara asked, curious despite her exhaustion. Della glanced at her sideways, something considering in her expression. "No," she admitted. "Most guests, if you can call them that, are handed off to junior staff and rarely spoken to by anyone above them. You are the first debt collection I have seen him dismiss an entire room to speak with alone." Alara absorbed that piece of information carefully, filing it away alongside everything else she had learned in the past hour. "Is that unusual?" "Unusual does not begin to describe it," Della said. "Cale Draven does not explain himself to anyone, and he certainly does not linger over conversations with people he intends to simply dismiss as payment for a debt. Whatever just happened in that room, I suspect even he does not fully understand it yet." They reached a wing of the fortress that felt different from the grand formal halls Alara had walked through earlier. Warmer somehow, with soft carpet running down the center of the corridor, and smaller, more personal doors lining either side. Della stopped before one of them and pushed it open, revealing a bedroom far grander than anything Alara had ever slept in. A large bed with heavy blankets, a window overlooking dark hills beyond the fortress walls, and a small fire already burning in a modest hearth. "This will be your room for now," Della said. "There are clothes in the wardrobe, should you need something other than what you brought with you. Breakfast is served in the main hall, though I suspect, given tonight, someone will be sent to collect you, rather than leave you to find your way alone." "Thank you," Alara said, meaning it despite everything, grateful for even this small kindness, in a place that had otherwise shown her nothing but cold calculation, since the moment she arrived. Della lingered at the doorway a moment longer, studying Alara, with an expression that was difficult to read. "A word of advice," she said finally. "If you will accept it from someone who has lived within these walls far longer than you have breathed air outside them, whatever you said to him tonight, whatever made him look at you the way he did when I came to collect you, be careful how much of it you offer freely. Curiosity, in a man like him, can be a dangerous thing to inspire." "Dangerous how?" Alara asked, unease creeping back into her chest. "Dangerous, because he is not accustomed to wanting anything," Della said simply. "And men who are not accustomed to wanting things rarely know how to want them gently." She left without another word, closing the door softly behind her, and Alara stood alone in the center of the unfamiliar room, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of wind moving against the old stone walls. She set her small bag down on the bed and sank onto the edge of the mattress, finally allowing the exhaustion of the night to catch up with her all at once. She thought of her father, still sitting frozen in that chair back home, and wondered if he had slept at all, wondered if he even deserved to. She thought of the empty house, the porch light still burning against the dark, and the life she had lived there that now felt impossibly far away, separated from her not just by distance, but by everything that had happened in these last few hours. And she thought of Cale Draven, of the storm-gray eyes that had studied her as though she were a puzzle worth solving, of the question that had seemed to genuinely trouble him, "Why aren't you afraid of me?" and of her own answer, which had surprised even her with how true it had turned out to be. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know whether she had made herself safer tonight by refusing to show fear, or whether she had simply made herself more interesting to a man capable of things far worse than fear itself. But exhaustion eventually won over uncertainty, and somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, Elara finally closed her eyes and slept, wrapped in unfamiliar blankets, inside unfamiliar walls, beginning a life she had never asked for, and could not yet begin to understand. Raised voices outside her door pulled Elara out of sleep before the sun had fully risen. She sat up quickly, heart racing, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar room, before the events of the previous night came rushing back to her all at once. The voices grew sharper, a man and a woman arguing in low, urgent tones just beyond the wall. "She should not be given a room in this wing," the man was saying. "She is a payment, nothing more. Put her with the household staff where she belongs." "He gave the order himself," the woman replied, and Elara recognized Della's voice immediately. "If you have a complaint, take it to him directly. I am simply following instructions." "He is not thinking clearly," the man snapped. "A debt collection sleeping in the guest wing, treated like she matters. It sends the wrong message to the entire pack." Elara rose from the bed and moved quietly toward the door, pressing her ear close enough to hear without opening it, her pulse quickening with every word. "Careful," Della warned, her voice dropping lower. "Words like that, said where the wrong ears might hear them, could cost you more than a disagreement over guest rooms." There was a pause, tense and heavy, before the man spoke again, quieter now, but no less bitter. "I am only saying what half the pack is already thinking." He bought loyalty and territory with strength for years. Now he lets a stranger walk in and hands her comfort she has not earned. It is not right. Footsteps retreated down the corridor, and silence settled once more. Elara stepped back from the door, her stomach tight with unease. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that arriving here the way she had would not make her popular among the people who called this place home. But hearing it spoken so plainly, so early in the morning, made the reality of her situation sink in far deeper than it had the night before. A soft knock came at the door minutes later, and when she opened it, Della stood waiting, her expression carefully neutral, giving no indication that Elara had overheard anything at all. "Good morning," Della said. "I trust you slept." "Eventually," Elara replied. "I heard some of that, you know, the argument in the hallway." Della's composure flickered, just slightly. "Pack politics are complicated," she said. "Not everyone here will welcome you easily, especially not at first. It would be wise to keep your guard up, even within these walls." "Is it dangerous?" Elara asked. "Being disliked by his own people?" "It can be," Della admitted. "But you are under his protection now, whether you asked for it or not, and very few in this fortress are foolish enough to challenge that protection directly. It is the quieter dangers you should watch for, whispers, slights, the kind of resentment that grows in shadows rather than announcing itself in hallways." Elara absorbed the warning carefully as she dressed and followed Della through the fortress toward the main hall, passing by tall windows that let in pale morning light, and rooms she had not seen the night before, libraries and studies, and long galleries lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women, who she assumed were rulers who had come before Kale. The fortress felt different in daylight, less like a place from a nightmare, and more like an enormous, ancient home that had simply grown too large for warmth to reach every corner of it. The main hall, when they reached it, was already occupied by a dozen or so people seated at a long wooden table, eating in relative silence. Conversation dimmed noticeably the moment Elara entered the room, heads turning to study her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. She kept her chin lifted, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of their attention, and took the seat Della indicated near the far end of the table. A young woman sitting nearby offered her a small, hesitant smile, the first genuinely friendly expression Elara had encountered since arriving. "I am Clara," she said quietly, sliding a plate of food toward her. "Do not mind the others. They are cautious around anyone new, especially anyone who arrives the way you did." "Thank you," Elara said, grateful for even this small gesture of kindness. "Is it always this tense here?" Clara glanced briefly around the table before answering, lowering her voice further. "It has been tense for a long time," she admitted. "Long before you arrived. There are pressures on him that most of the pack does not fully understand. Threats from other territories, old alliances that have grown thin. Your arrival has simply given people something new to talk about, instead of the things that actually frighten them." Before Elara could ask what she meant, a broad-shouldered man rose from farther down the table, The same man, she realized, whose voice she had recognized from the argument outside her door that morning. He studied her openly, his expression cold. "So this is the one everyone is whispering about," he said, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Tell me, girl, what exactly did you say to him last night to earn a room in the guest wing? Most debts are handled far more quickly, and far less comfortably." The table fell silent, every eye turning toward her, waiting to see how she would respond. Alara set down her fork carefully, meeting his gaze without flinching, though her heart pounded hard enough that she was certain everyone nearby could see the pulse fluttering at her throat. "I told him the truth," she said evenly, "something I imagine does not happen often enough around men who inspire this much fear in the people who serve them." A few sharp intakes of breath sounded around the table, and the man's expression darkened further, his jaw tightening. "You would do well to remember your place," he said. "Whatever games he is playing with you, they will not last. Debts get collected, interest fades, and when it does, you will find this pack remembers exactly what you were brought here to be." The voice cut through the room like a blade, calm but absolute, and every person at the table straightened immediately, including the man who had just spoken. Alara turned to see Cale standing in the doorway, dressed simply, but carrying that same effortless authority she had noticed the night before, his storm-gray eyes moving slowly across the room, before settling on the man called Garrick. "You have something to say to our guest," Cale said, his tone deceptively mild. "You may say it to me instead." Garrick's expression shifted rapidly from defiance to something far more careful. "I meant no disrespect, my lord. I was simply reminding her of her circumstances." "Her circumstances," Cale repeated slowly, walking further into the room, "are not yours to define. Not anymore." He came to stand near the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the assembled pack members, each of whom seemed to find something suddenly fascinating about their own plates. "Alara Voss is under my protection. Whatever debt her father owed has been transferred to my judgment, and my judgment alone. Anyone who forgets that will answer to me directly." The silence that followed was absolute. Garrick lowered his eyes and returned to his seat without another word, and the rest of the table resumed eating, with careful, deliberate normalcy, though Alara could feel the weight of unspoken tension still hanging thick in the air. Cale's gaze finally shifted to her, something unreadable passing behind those pale eyes. "Walk with me," he said. It was not quite a request. Alara rose from her seat, aware of every eye following her as she crossed the room to join him, and together they left the main hall, walking down a quiet corridor that led toward an open courtyard she had not yet seen. Morning light spilled across neatly kept gardens, and for the first time since arriving, Alara felt as though she could breathe without an audience watching her every reaction. "I apologize for Garrick," Cale said once they were alone. "He has served this pack a long time, and loyalty like his often comes wrapped in resentment toward anything unfamiliar." "You did not need to defend me," Alara said, though she was grateful he had. "I am capable of handling myself." "I noticed," Cale said, something almost like approval coloring his voice. "You did not back down from him, not even for a moment. That is rare, even among my own people." They walked in silence for a while, the gravel path crunching softly beneath their feet, the early morning air still cool and sharp. Alara studied him carefully as they walked, searching for some crack in the composed exterior he wore so effortlessly, some sign of the man Della had hinted at the night before, a man not accustomed to wanting anything, and therefore uncertain how to want gently. "May I ask you something?" she said finally. "You may ask," he replied. "I make no promises about answering. Why did you collect this debt personally? Della told me it is unusual, that men in your position rarely bother themselves with matters this small." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line beyond the garden walls. "Your father's debt was not as small as you might think," he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. "There are details surrounding it that I have not yet fully shared with you, details that made it impossible for me to hand this particular collection off to someone else." Alara's stomach tightened. "What kind of details?" "Not today," Cale said, and something in his tone told her the conversation, at least for now, was closed. There will be time for difficult truths later. For now, I would rather you have at least one morning in this place without more weight added to what you are already carrying. She wanted to press further, wanted to demand answers immediately, but something in the careful way he had spoken, something almost protective beneath the deflection, made her hesitate. You are not what I expected, she admitted instead, watching him carefully for his reaction. Neither are you, he said, and for just a moment, something almost like a genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth, before vanishing again beneath his usual composure. Come, there is much of this fortress you have not yet seen, and I find, strangely, that I would rather show it to you myself than leave that task to someone else. Ilara fell into step beside him, uncertain what to make of the strange, careful warmth beginning to grow between them, uncertain whether to trust it or fear it, but aware, with a clarity that unsettled her more than anything Garrick had said at breakfast, that whatever secrets Cale Draven was keeping about her father's debt, she intended to uncover every single one of them before this was over. Cale led her through a series of stone archways into a wing of the fortress she had not yet seen, where the walls grew older, the stonework rougher, as though this section had survived from a time long before the polished halls near the entrance had been built. This part of the fortress is the oldest, he explained, running his fingers briefly along the rough wall as they passed. My family has ruled from these grounds for generations. Every king before me added something new. I have mostly left things as they were. Why? Ilara asked, genuinely curious. Because some things deserve to remain untouched, he said, even by kings who believe they know better than the people who came before them. They passed through a long gallery lined with portraits, and Ilara slowed her steps, studying the painted faces staring down at her from ornate frames. Each one carried the same sharp jaw, the same storm-colored eyes she had noticed in Cale the night before, generations of the same bloodline staring out across centuries. Your family, she said softly. My family, he confirmed, his voice carrying a weight she had not heard from him before, something heavier than simple pride. He stopped in front of one particular portrait, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed almost out of place among the stern faces surrounding her. My mother, he said, before Ilara could ask. She looks kind, Ilara said carefully, sensing the sudden change in his demeanor. She was, Cale said, the kindest ruler this pack ever had, and the least suited for the position she was born into. Kindness, in a world like this one, is often mistaken for weakness. It cost her a great deal, in the end. Ilara wanted to ask what had happened to her, wanted to understand the shadow that had crossed his face the moment he mentioned her, but something in his posture told her the door on that conversation had already closed as quickly as it had opened. She filed the question away instead, another small piece of the puzzle that was Cale Draven, to examine later when the timing felt right. They continued through the gallery in comfortable silence, and gradually, Ilara found herself relaxing in a way she had not expected, the tension of the morning slowly easing, as Cale pointed out small details throughout the fortress. An old training yard where pack members still sparred each morning, a library filled with texts far older than anything she had ever encountered, a modest chapel tucked into a quiet corner where, he explained, important ceremonies were still held, according to old traditions. You know this place well, she observed. I have lived here my entire life, he said. Every stone in these walls has a memory attached to it. Some good, most difficult. It is not always an easy thing, inheriting a place built on the successes and failures of everyone who came before you. Is that why you seem so guarded? Ilara asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Because you carry all of that with you, all the time? Cale glanced at her sideways, something considering in his expression, as though surprised by how easily she had touched on something true. Perhaps, he admitted. Very few people ask me questions like that. Most are too afraid, or too focused on what they want from me, to wonder what carrying this position actually costs. I am not most people, Ilara said simply. No, he agreed, something almost fond entering his voice for just a moment. You are not. They were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor behind them, and both turned to see a young man approaching quickly, his expression tight with urgency, that immediately shifted the atmosphere between them, from something warm to something sharp and alert. My lord, the young man said, slightly breathless, a message has arrived, from the southern border. It concerns Alpha Victor. Cale's entire demeanor changed instantly, the ease that had settled over him during the tour vanishing beneath something colder, more focused, more dangerous. What does it say? He requests a meeting, the messenger said, within the week. He claims it concerns matters of mutual interest along the shared territory line, but the tone of the letter suggests something else entirely. Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ilara caught a glimpse of something beneath his composed exterior, something that looked almost like restrained anger, or perhaps concern, though he masked it quickly before turning back to her. "Forgive me," he said. "There is business I must attend to. Della will show you the rest of the fortress, if you wish to continue exploring." "Is everything all right?" Ilara asked, unable to stop herself from noticing how quickly the warmth between them had disappeared beneath whatever news had just arrived. "It will be," Cale said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely certain of that himself. "Alpha Victor has been testing the borders of this territory for months. This is simply the latest attempt to see how far he can push before I decide to push back." "Who is he?" Ilara asked. "This Alpha Victor?" Cale's expression darkened further, and when he answered, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more careful, as though even speaking the name required a measure of restraint. "He is the leader of the pack that borders mine to the south," he said, "a man who has spent years trying to expand his territory, through intimidation, rather than earning it honestly. He and I have never been allies, and lately, he has grown bolder about testing exactly how much that lack of alliance might cost him." Something in the way he said it made Ilara's stomach tighten with an unease she could not quite name, a feeling that this conversation, and the tension radiating from the messenger's news, was somehow connected to more than simple border politics. "I should go," Cale said, already turning to follow the messenger back down the corridor. He paused after a few steps, glancing back at her with an expression that was difficult to read, something between reluctance and reassurance. "We will finish this conversation later, Ilara. I promise you that." She watched him walk away, his broad shoulders set with a tension that had not been there minutes earlier, and found herself standing alone in the quiet gallery, surrounded by generations of painted eyes staring down at her from the walls, wondering what exactly a man like Alpha Victor had to do with her, and why the mention of his name had made Cale's careful composure crack for the very first time since she had met him. She thought of her father's debt, of the details Cale had refused to share with her that morning, of the strange, unusual attention he had paid to a collection that should have been small and insignificant. And slowly, standing there in the silence of that ancient gallery, a new and unsettling possibility began to take shape in her mind, one she was not yet ready to fully consider, but one she suspected, with a growing certainty she could not shake, might hold the key to understanding exactly why she had been brought to this place at all. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind her, and Ilara spun around fast, her heart slamming against her ribs, certain for one terrifying second that someone had been standing close enough to touch her without her noticing. The gallery stretched empty in both directions, shadows pooling beneath the tall windows as evening light began to fade outside. She stood perfectly still, straining her ears, certain she had heard footsteps retreating somewhere just beyond her sight. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. No answer came, only silence and the distant sound of wind pressing against old stone. She told herself it was nothing, an old building settling, the natural creaks of a fortress this ancient shifting with the temperature of the evening. But the unease lingered as she made her way back through the corridors alone, Della nowhere in sight, Cale still occupied with whatever news had arrived about the man called Alpha Victor. She found her way eventually to the library Cale had shown her earlier that day, drawn back to it by something she could not quite explain, a restless curiosity that refused to let her simply return to her room and wait for answers to come to her. The room was empty when she entered, tall shelves rising toward the ceiling, the last light of evening spilling through arched windows and catching dust motes drifting lazily through the air. She wandered along the shelves, running her fingers lightly across worn leather spines, when her attention caught on a small writing desk tucked into the corner near the window, papers stacked neatly upon its surface. She knew, immediately, that she should not approach it, that whatever sat on that desk was almost certainly not meant for her eyes. But the strange tension in Cale's expression when the messenger arrived, the way he had refused to explain the details of her father's debt, pulled her forward despite every instinct warning her to turn back. The topmost paper was a letter, the handwriting sharp and hurried, clearly written in some urgency. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines, before her breath caught in her throat. The debt owed by Henry Voss was never simply a matter of unpaid loans. The arrangement traces back through 3 intermediaries, each connected to territory disputes along the southern border. Recommend further investigation before final judgment is rendered regarding the daughter. Elara's hands trembled slightly as she read the words again, trying to make sense of them. Territory disputes. Intermediaries. Her father's debt was somehow tangled in whatever conflict existed between Cale and this Alpha Victor, and she was, apparently, part of a judgment still being rendered, a piece still being moved on a board she could not fully see. You should not be reading that. Elara startled violently, spinning around to find Cale standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the letter still clutched in her hand. She had not heard him enter, had not heard any warning at all, and the realization that he could move, that silently sent a fresh wave of unease through her chest. I did not mean to, she said, though the excuse felt weak, even as she spoke it. I was looking for something to read, and I found this instead. Cale, what does this mean? What territory disputes? What intermediaries? He crossed the room slowly, and for a moment, she thought he might simply take the letter from her hand without explanation, retreat once more behind the careful walls he had built around himself. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, studying her with an expression she could not fully read, something caught between frustration and reluctant resignation. I told you this morning there would be time for difficult truths later, he said. It seems later has arrived sooner than either of us expected. Then tell me, Elara said, lifting the letter slightly. Tell me what this actually means. Why was my father's debt connected to territory disputes with another pack? What does any of that have to do with me? Cale was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, clearly weighing how much to reveal, and how much to keep guarded. Sit, he said finally, gesturing to the chairs near the window. This time, Elara did not refuse. Your father's business dealings were more complicated than simple gambling debts, Cale began, once they were both seated, the letter resting on the small table between them. Years ago, before you were likely old enough to understand any of it, he became entangled with associates connected to Alpha Victor's territory. Loans were exchanged, favors called in, promises made that extended far beyond simple money. When those arrangements began to collapse, the debt was eventually transferred into my jurisdiction, through channels that are, admittedly, difficult to fully untangle even now. So my father owed money to Victor's people originally, Elara said slowly, trying to piece it together. And somehow that debt ended up with you instead. Debts move between territories more often than you might think, Cale said. Especially debts large enough to matter, and complicated enough to create leverage for whoever holds them. When I learned the details surrounding your father's arrangement, I made the decision to collect it personally, rather than allow it to remain a bargaining piece that Victor's people could use against my territory. Elara's mind raced, trying to understand the implications of what he was telling her. You are saying I am not just a debt payment, she said slowly. I am leverage. Data for, in whatever conflict exists between you and this Alpha Victor. That is part of it, Cale admitted, and something in his voice suggested there was more he was not yet willing to say. Though I want you to understand, whatever role your presence here plays in matters between myself and Victor, it is not the only reason I chose to handle this personally. Then what is the other reason? Elara pressed, watching him carefully. Cale hesitated, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something close to uncertainty cross his face, a rare crack in the composed exterior he wore so carefully around everyone else. I am still working that out myself, he admitted quietly. Last night, when you looked at me without fear, without the desperation I have grown accustomed to seeing in people who arrive here the way you did, something about it unsettled me in a way I did not expect. I have spent years surrounded by people who either fear me or want something from me. You appeared to want neither. Elara felt her chest tighten at the honesty in his voice, unprepared for how vulnerable he sounded in that moment, how different it felt from the composed, unreadable king who had studied her from across the firelit room the night before. I am still afraid, she admitted quietly. I told you that already. I am simply choosing not to let it control how I act. I know, Cale said. And that, more than anything, is what I find myself unable to stop thinking about. The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence she had experienced since arriving, charged with something neither of them seemed willing to name directly. Elara studied his face, searching for the calculating king she had first encountered, and finding instead someone far more complicated, someone burdened by inherited grief and old conflicts, and a growing uncertainty about a girl who refused to behave the way everyone else around him behaved. What happens now? She asked finally. With Victor. With whatever leverage my presence here represents. Now, Cale said, rising from his chair, his composure returning like a mask settling back into place. I attend to matters that require careful handling, and I ensure that whatever games Victor intends to play, he understands clearly that you are protected within these walls, regardless of the reasons that first brought you here. He moved toward the door, then paused, glancing back at her, with an expression that lingered somewhere between warning and something softer he did not quite allow himself to voice. Stay away from his letters, Elara, he said. Not because I do not trust you with the truth, but because there are pieces of this conflict still unfolding that even I do not yet fully understand. I would rather you learn the truth from me directly, when I am certain of what that truth actually is, than piece it together from fragments that might mislead you. He left without waiting for her response, and Elara sat alone in the quiet library as darkness fully settled outside the windows, turning the letter over in her hands one final time, before setting it carefully back on the desk, exactly where she had found it. Whatever complicated web connected her father's debt, Cale's careful protection, and the looming threat of Alpha Victor, she understood now that she had stepped into something far larger than a simple transaction between a desperate father and a powerful king. She was a piece on a board whose full shape she still could not see, and somewhere beyond these fortress walls, a man named Victor was already moving his own pieces into position, preparing for a confrontation that Elara suspected, with a growing certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, would eventually require her to choose a side whether she was ready to or not. Clara found her still sitting in the library some time later, the candles nearly burned down to their stubs, and gently suggested she return to her room before Della came looking for her. Elara walked back through the quiet corridors with Clara at her side, grateful for the company after a day that had left her mind spinning with questions she could not yet answer. You look troubled, Clara observed as they walked. More than this morning, even. I learned some things today, Elara admitted carefully, unwilling to share the full details even with someone who had shown her kindness. Things about why I am really here. Clara nodded slowly, as though she understood more than she was willing to say directly. This place has a way of revealing its secrets slowly, she said. Sometimes I think that is deliberate. Sometimes I think even he does not fully control what gets revealed and when. You mean Cale? I mean the fortress itself, in a way, Clara said, with a small, tired smile. It has survived so many rulers, so many conflicts, that sometimes it feels as though the walls themselves decide what secrets are ready to surface, regardless of what anyone standing inside them intends. They reached Elara's door, and Clara paused before leaving, glancing up and down the empty corridor with a caution that seemed almost reflexive. Be careful who you trust here, she said quietly. Not everyone in this fortress wants the same things Cale wants. Not everyone believes protecting you serves the pack's best interests. Is that a warning? Elara asked. It is advice, Clara said, from someone who has watched too many people underestimate how dangerous quiet resentment can become, especially when it has years to grow before anyone notices it. She left before Elara could ask her to explain further, disappearing down the corridor with quick, quiet steps. Elara pushed open her bedroom door, exhausted, her mind still turning over everything she had learned, ready simply to collapse into bed and let sleep pull her away from a day that had asked far more of her than she felt prepared to give. She stopped short the moment she stepped inside. Something felt wrong. The fire in the hearth, which should have burned low after hours untended, had been freshly stoked, flames crackling high and bright against the stone. Her small bag, which she had left resting on the dresser that morning, now sat open on the bed, its contents disturbed, the photograph of her mother pulled halfway out of its protective sleeve, as though someone had been examining it and had not bothered to be careful about putting it back. Her heart began to pound as she scanned the rest of the room, searching for any other sign of disturbance. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the sense that someone had been here, had touched her belongings, had gone through the small handful of things she had carried from her old life into this strange new one, left her feeling exposed, in a way she had not felt since the men first broke into her childhood home. She crossed the room quickly and gathered her belongings back into the bag, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the photograph of her mother back into its sleeve. A folded piece of paper slipped out from beneath the bag as she lifted it, one she was certain had not been there before. She unfolded it slowly, her breath catching as she read the short, sharp message written in unfamiliar handwriting. Debts are not always paid to the ones who collect them. Remember who you truly belong to. Ilara read the words 3 times, her pulse hammering in her ears, trying to make sense of the threat and understand exactly who might have left it. It could have been Garrick, still bitter about the confrontation at breakfast. It could have been anyone within these walls who resented her presence, who believed, as the argument outside her door that morning suggested, that she did not belong in the guest wing at all. But something about the wording unsettled her more deeply than simple pack resentment could explain. Remember who you truly belong to. It felt less like a threat from someone within Cale's household, and more like a message from somewhere else entirely. A reminder from beyond these walls that her father's debt, and everything tangled up within it, might not be settled as simply as Cale seemed to believe. She moved quickly to the door and pulled it open, intending to find Della, or perhaps Cale himself, to show them what she had found. But the corridor outside stood empty, silent except for the distant sound of wind pressing against the ancient stone walls, and somewhere far below, faint and easily missed if she had not been listening for it, the sound of a door closing softly, as though whoever had left the note had only just slipped away into the darkness of the fortress, close enough that she might have caught them if she had returned only moments sooner. Ilara closed her door and pressed her back against it, the folded note still clutched tightly in her hand, and felt, for the first time since arriving at this fortress, a fear sharper and more immediate than anything she had experienced the night the men broke into her home. Whatever conflict existed between Cale and Alpha Victor, whatever role her father's debt played within it, she understood now, with sudden and chilling clarity, that the danger surrounding her had already found its way inside these walls, closer than she had ever imagined it could reach. She did not wait until morning. Ilara ran through the darkened corridors barefoot, the note clutched tightly in her fist, her breath coming fast, as she searched for anyone who could help her make sense of what had just happened. She found Cale in a small study near the training yard, still awake despite the late hour, papers spread across his desk, his expression tightening the moment he saw her face. "What happened?" he asked, already rising from his chair. She held out the note without a word, watching his expression shift from concern to something colder, sharper, as he read the message twice before setting it down carefully on the desk. "Someone was in my room," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, given how badly her hands were still shaking. "They went through my things. This was left behind." Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the composed king vanished entirely, replaced by something far more dangerous, a barely contained fury that radiated from him like heat from a fire. "Show me exactly where you found it," he said, already moving toward the door. They walked quickly back through the corridors together, and Ilara explained everything: the disturbed bag, the freshly stoked fire, the sound of a door closing somewhere below just as she discovered the note. Cale listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every detail, until they reached her room and he examined it himself, checking the window latch, the wardrobe, every corner where someone might have hidden or slipped through unnoticed. "The window was not forced," he said finally, straightening from his examination. "Whoever did this either had a key or knew someone within these walls who was willing to give them access." "You think it was someone from your own pack," Ilara said slowly. "I think," Cale said carefully, "that this note was not written by anyone loyal to me. Remember who you truly belong to. That is not the language of a pack member resentful of your presence here. That is the language of someone reminding you that your father's original arrangement was never truly with me at all." Ilara's stomach turned cold. "You think this came from Victor's people? That someone here is working for him?" "I think it is very likely," Cale said grimly, "and I intend to find out exactly who, before this goes any further." He called for guards immediately, And within minutes, the quiet fortress had transformed into something far more alert. Torches lit along every corridor. Pack members roused from sleep and questioned in low, urgent voices. Elara stood in the center of it all, feeling strangely responsible for the chaos she had caused, simply by existing within these walls, watching Cale move through his people, with a controlled intensity that left no doubt about how seriously he took the threat against her. "You should not have to see this," he said, returning to her side once the initial search had begun, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "I am sorry. I told you that you would be protected here, and within a day, someone has already proven that promise harder to keep than I intended." "It is not your fault," Elara said, though the fear in her chest had not fully faded. "Whoever did this, they wanted me to be afraid. I would rather not give them that satisfaction, even now." Something in Cale's expression softened, admiration, flickering briefly behind the tension still tightening his features. "You continue to surprise me," he said quietly. "Even now, with a stranger's threat sitting fresh in your hand, you refuse to let fear win." "I told you," Elara said. "It only ever makes things worse." He studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before gesturing toward the corridor. "Come," he said. "You should not stay in this room tonight, not until we understand exactly how someone gained access to it. There is a room near my own quarters that will be far more difficult for anyone to reach unnoticed." Elara followed him without argument, too unsettled by the night's events to protest the closer proximity, grateful instead for the sense of safety his presence seemed to offer, despite everything uncertain still surrounding her. The room he led her to was smaller than her previous one, simpler, clearly meant for practical purposes rather than impressing guests, but it felt, in that moment, far safer than anywhere else in the fortress. "Rest if you can," Cale said, lingering in the doorway. "I will have guards posted throughout the night. Nothing will reach you here." "Cale," Elara said, stopping him before he could leave. "Earlier today, you mentioned your mother. In the gallery, you said kindness cost her a great deal. What happened to her?" His expression closed slightly, an old guardedness settling back over his features, but this time, perhaps because of everything the night had already stripped away between them, he did not deflect the question entirely. "She was killed," he said quietly. 15 years ago, during a period of conflict very similar to what is beginning to build now, between myself and Victor's territory, she believed diplomacy could resolve disputes that others believed only strength could settle. She was wrong, and the pack paid a terrible price for her mistake, myself most of all. "I am so sorry," Elara said softly, the weight of his admission settling heavily between them. "It taught me a great deal about how this world actually works," Cale continued, his voice carrying old grief, carefully controlled beneath years of practiced composure. "Kindness without strength behind it is simply an invitation for people like Victor to take whatever they believe they can claim. I built the reputation I carry now because I refused to let what happened to her happen again, to me or to anyone under my protection." Elara understood, suddenly and completely, why he had reacted so strongly to the threat left in her room, why the composed king had briefly vanished entirely into something far more dangerous the moment he read those words. This was not simply about pride, or territory, or the complicated politics of debts and leverage. This was about a wound that had never fully healed, a fear buried deep beneath years of careful strength, that history might repeat itself, that someone under his protection might pay the price for danger he had failed to see coming in time. "You are not her," Elara said gently. "And I am not asking you to be gentle instead of strong. I am simply grateful that whatever strength you carry, tonight, you chose to use it protecting me." Something shifted in Cale's expression, a vulnerability she had not seen from him before, brief and unguarded, before he composed himself once more. "Sleep, Elara," he said softly. "We will find whoever did this, I promise you that." He left, closing the door quietly behind him, and Elara sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed for a long while, listening to the distant sounds of guards moving through the corridors, processing everything the night had revealed. She thought of the note still resting on Cale's desk, of the careful investigation already underway, of the dangerous man named Victor, whose shadow seemed to stretch further into this fortress than anyone had realized. But mostly, she thought of Cale's face, as he spoke about his mother, the old grief carefully buried beneath years of practiced strength, and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the wall he had built around himself was not cruelty at all. It was armor, forged from loss, worn so long that he had perhaps forgotten there was still a person underneath it, someone capable of genuine warmth, genuine fear, genuine care, if only someone patient enough came along willing to look past the strength and see what it had been built to protect. A drawer that should have been locked slid open easily beneath Alara's hand, and her breath caught the moment she saw the thickness of the folder waiting inside it. She had returned to the study alone the following afternoon, restless and unable to stop turning Victor's parting words over in her mind, determined to search through whatever records remained of her father's original dealings, while Cale was occupied with his advisors preparing for the escalation they both now expected. She had not intended to open drawers that were not hers to open, but the unlocked one had caught her attention, and once she saw her father's name scrawled across the folder's edge, she could not make herself walk away without looking. The papers inside told a story far older and far more deliberate than anything she had imagined. Financial records stretched back nearly 8 years, long before her father's business had shown any public sign of trouble, documenting a slow, careful pattern of loans offered through intermediaries connected to Victor's territory, loans structured in ways that seemed almost designed to eventually collapse, interest rates buried in fine print, repayment terms quietly altered, opportunities for legitimate business deals that always, somehow, fell through at the worst possible moment. This was not a man who had simply gambled his family's fortune away through poor decisions. This was a man who had been carefully, deliberately ruined, piece by piece, over years, by people working for Victor, people who had clearly understood from the very beginning exactly where this debt would eventually need to be paid. Her hands trembled as she found a final document near the bottom of the folder, a report written in Cale's own investigator's careful handwriting, dated weeks before she had ever arrived at this fortress. Preliminary findings strongly suggest Henry Voss's financial ruin was orchestrated deliberately, likely as a long-term mechanism to create leverage against House Draven through means not yet fully understood. Recommend immediate further investigation before any action is taken regarding the daughter. Weeks before she arrived, Cale had known, or at least strongly suspected, that her father's ruin was deliberate, engineered specifically to eventually reach him, long before she ever stood in that firelit room and answered his question about fear. He had told her, in the library, that the debt was complicated, that there were details he was not yet ready to share. He had never once told her it might have all been designed from the very beginning to end exactly where it had ended. She was still standing there, the report clutched tightly in her shaking hands, when Cale entered the study and found her. "Alara," he said, his expression shifting immediately from surprise to careful alarm as he registered what she was holding. "That drawer should have been locked. I apologize. I did not intend for you to find that particular file without—" "Without what?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended, hurt bleeding through the anger rising in her chest. "Without you deciding I was finally ready to know the truth? This report is dated weeks before I arrived here, Cale. You knew, or at least suspected, that my father's ruin was deliberate, orchestrated specifically to create leverage against you, and you let me believe for days that this was simply a complicated debt I did not yet understand. I did not want to burden you with theories that were not yet confirmed," Cale said, though even as he spoke the words, she could see him recognizing how weak they sounded. "I wanted to be certain before I told you something this significant, something that would change how you understood everything that brought you here. You do not get to decide what I am ready to hear," Alara said, anger and betrayal tangling painfully together. "This is my family, my father, my life, torn apart over years by people I never even knew existed, and you kept that from me while we sat together going through records, while I trusted you with questions I never imagined I would trust anyone with again. I was trying to protect you," Cale said, his voice tightening with frustration of his own now, "from uncertainty, from theories that might have turned out to mean nothing." "Do not tell me what you were trying to do," Alara interrupted, stepping back from him, putting distance between them that felt far larger than the physical space of the small study. "Tell me the truth, all of it, right now, or I will never trust another word you say to me again." Cale's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, some internal struggle visible behind his controlled expression. Finally, he exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its careful composure entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded that she had not heard from him before. My investigators believe Victor targeted your father, specifically because of a connection between our families that predates either of us, he said. Your mother, Ilara, before she married your father, she spent time within territories allied to House Draven. There are records suggesting she and my mother knew each other, that some old friendship or alliance existed between them that Victor may have discovered and decided to exploit years later, long after both of them had passed. Ilara felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. My mother knew your mother, she repeated slowly, trying to absorb the implications of something she had never once considered possible. We do not yet know the full nature of that connection, Cale said. It may have been simple friendship. It may have been something more significant, some alliance or debt of its own that outlived both women. What we do know is that Victor appears to have spent years constructing your father's ruin, specifically because of whatever that connection was, patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment to use it against me. And you knew this, Ilara said, her voice shaking now. And you let me sit beside you these past days, believing we were uncovering this mystery together, when you already understood far more than you were telling me. I was afraid, Cale admitted quietly, the confession clearly costing him something significant, afraid that if I told you everything too quickly, you would see yourself only as a piece in Victor's long game, rather than as the person I had already come to genuinely care about. I wanted you to trust what was growing between us, before I gave you reason to doubt whether any of it was real, or whether it was simply the outcome of a scheme neither of us fully understood. The raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard, softening the sharp edge of her anger just slightly, though the hurt underneath it remained just as deep. You do not get to decide that for me, she said, quieter now but no less firm. I deserve to know the truth from the beginning, Cale, regardless of how it might have made either of us feel. I have spent my entire life with people deciding what I was capable of handling, deciding what truths I deserved and which ones I did not. My father did it when he offered me as payment, without ever asking what I wanted. I will not accept it from you as well, no matter how gently you try to justify it. Cale was silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her words, before finally nodding slowly. You are right, he said. I am sorry, Ilara. Truly. I let old fears about losing what mattered to me guide decisions that were never mine alone to make. It will not happen again. Ilara studied him carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the words, and found it there, genuine and unguarded, the same vulnerability she had glimpsed the night he told her about his mother's death. But the hurt of the betrayal, however well-intentioned, remained lodged deep in her chest, and she was not yet ready to simply let it go. I need time, she said finally, time to think through what this means, about my family, about my mother, about everything I thought I understood about why I am really here. Take whatever time you need, Cale said quietly, stepping back to give her the space she was silently asking for. I will not push you toward forgiveness before you are ready to offer it. She left the study without another word, the report still clutched in her hand, her mind spinning with questions about a mother she had lost too young to ever truly understand, about connections and alliances that stretched back further than she had ever imagined, and about a king whose careful protection, however well-meaning, had cost her something she was not yet certain how to fully repair. Outside, storm clouds had begun gathering over the distant hills, dark and heavy, mirroring the turmoil settling deep in her chest, as she walked alone through corridors that had begun, over these past days, to feel almost like home, only to remember now that even here, surrounded by growing trust and quiet warmth, the truth had a way of arriving late, and costing more than anyone was ever fully prepared to pay. She found Della in the household office, sorting through supply ledgers with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and Ilara hesitated only a moment before stepping inside and closing the door behind her. You have been here a long time, Ilara said. Long enough to remember Cale's mother, perhaps. Della's hands stilled over the ledgers, something careful entering her expression. I remember her well, she said. Why do you ask? Because apparently my mother knew her, Ilara said, setting the report down on the desk between them. Before either of them died, I need to know if you remember anything about that, anything at all. Della studied the report for a long moment, reading it carefully, before looking up at Alara with an expression that had softened considerably. I remember a woman who used to visit sometimes, years before you would have been born, she said slowly. Kale's mother had few close friends outside the pack, given her position, but there was a woman who came from outside our territories, who she seemed to trust deeply. They would walk the gardens together for hours. I never learned her name, only that she was human, and that her visits always seemed to bring the old queen genuine joy in a life that did not offer her much of it. Do you think it could have been her? Alara asked. My mother? I cannot say for certain, Della admitted. It was a long time ago, and I was young myself then, more concerned with my own duties than with paying close attention to visitors I assumed had little bearing on my life. But if you are asking whether it is possible, I would say yes. More than possible, given everything you have just shown me. Alara sat down slowly in the chair across from Della's desk, the weight of the revelation settling heavier, now that someone else had confirmed even the possibility of it. Why would she never tell me? She asked, more to herself than to Della. Why would my mother never once mention that she had known a queen, that she had walked these very gardens before I was ever born? Perhaps she had her reasons, Della said gently. Friendships between humans and pack royalty were not always simple, even in gentler times. There may have been complications neither of them wished to pass on to their children, complications that Victor, patient as he apparently is, eventually found a way to exploit regardless of how carefully they were once hidden. Alara absorbed this in silence, grief for a mother she had lost too young, mixing painfully with anger, at a man she had never met. A man calculating enough to wait years, perhaps even decades, for exactly the right moment to turn an old friendship into a weapon. Thank you, she said finally, rising from the chair, for telling me what you remember, even if it is not much. For what it is worth, Della said, as Alara reached the door, I do not think Kale kept this from you out of cruelty. Whatever mistakes he made and how he handled it, I have watched that man carry grief about his mother for 15 years, without allowing anyone close enough to help him carry it. That he told you as much as he did, that he showed you any of this at all, tells me something has genuinely shifted in him since you arrived here. Alara left the household office with Della's words turning over in her mind, uncertain whether they eased the hurt still sitting heavy in her chest, or simply complicated it further. She wandered the fortress for a long while afterward, unwilling to return to her room, unwilling to seek out Kale before she had fully processed everything the day had revealed, until the sound of raised voices near the eastern wall pulled her sharply out of her thoughts. She followed the sound cautiously, rounding a corner to find two guards restraining a stranger near the servants' entrance, the man struggling against their grip, while a third guard searched through a bag he had apparently been carrying. Kale arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, his expression darkening the instant he saw what the guards had found inside the bag, a collection of maps marked with the fortress's internal layout, annotated in a hand that was clearly not one of his own household staff. Another one, Kale said grimly, studying the maps before turning his attention to the captured man. Working for Victor as well, I assume. The stranger said nothing, his jaw set in stubborn defiance, but the maps spoke clearly enough on their own. Careful annotations marking guard rotations, weak points in the perimeter, and, Alara noticed with a chill running down her spine, a small mark beside the section of the fortress that included the guest wing, where her original room had been located. He was targeting me specifically, she said quietly, stepping closer despite Kale's instinctive move to keep her at a distance from the captured intruder. It appears so, Kale confirmed, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. Victor is growing bolder faster than I anticipated. 2 attempts within the same number of weeks suggests he no longer feels the need for subtlety. The guards led the stranger away for questioning, and Kale turned to Alara, the earlier tension between them briefly forgotten beneath the more immediate danger the discovery represented. This changes things, he said. I had hoped we would have more time to prepare before Victor moved beyond threats and messages. It appears that time is shorter than either of us realized. What do we do now? Alara asked, fear and determination once again tangling together in her chest. We increase security throughout the fortress, Kale said, and we accelerate whatever preparations remain, for the possibility that Victor intends more than simple intimidation. He paused, studying her carefully, something softer entering his expression despite the urgency of the moment. Alara, regardless of where things stand between us after what you learned today, I need you to understand that your safety remains my absolute priority. Whatever mistakes I made in how I handled the truth, that has never changed, and it never will. Alara held his gaze for a long moment, the hurt from earlier still present, but softened now by the shared danger pressing in around them both, by Della's words about grief, carried alone for 15 years, by the genuine worry she could see plainly in his expression, despite his careful composure. I am still angry with you, she said honestly, but I do not doubt that you want to keep me safe. Those two things can exist together, I think, at least for now, while we figure out exactly how dangerous Victor truly intends to become. That is more grace than I probably deserve, Cale said quietly. Probably, Alara agreed, something almost like a small, tired smile touching her lips despite everything. But we can discuss what you do, and do not deserve, once we are certain neither of us is about to be dragged into whatever war Victor seems determined to start. They stood together near the eastern wall, as the last light of the overcast day faded into evening, the captured intruder's maps a stark reminder that whatever fragile trust and growing warmth had built between them over these past weeks, now existed inside a fortress that Victor had proven, twice now, he could reach into whenever he chose. The storm clouds that had gathered earlier finally broke, rain beginning to fall steadily against the ancient stones, and somewhere beyond those walls, Alara understood with growing certainty, a much larger storm was gathering as well, one that neither careful investigation nor cautious diplomacy would be enough to stop for very much longer. A horn sounded from the outer wall before dawn, sharp and urgent, and Alara was on her feet and out of bed before she had even fully registered the sound. Memories of the intruder captured only days earlier, flooding back with immediate, breathless panic. She found the corridor outside her room already filled with guards moving quickly toward the eastern stair, their expressions tight with the particular urgency reserved for genuine emergencies rather than routine drills. "What is happening?" she asked, catching the arm of a passing guard. "Skirmish at the southern border post," he said, barely slowing his pace. "Victor's forces tested our patrol line an hour ago. No casualties yet, but the Alpha King has already gone to assess the damage himself." Alara's stomach dropped. She dressed quickly and made her way toward the main hall, where Della was already directing a flurry of activity, messengers coming and going, supplies being organized, the entire fortress shifting into something that felt uncomfortably close to preparation for war. "He left before sunrise," Della confirmed when Alara found her. "Took a dozen guards with him. He should return by midday, assuming nothing further develops at the border." The hours that followed passed with agonizing slowness, Alara pacing the halls, unable to focus on anything, her mind circling endlessly around worst possibilities she could not stop imagining. When Cale finally returned, mud splattered and visibly exhausted, she found herself moving toward him before she had consciously decided to, relief overwhelming whatever careful distance still remained between them since their argument in the study. "You are unharmed," she said, more statement than question, searching his face and posture for any sign of injury. "I am fine," Cale said, though the tightness around his eyes suggested the morning had cost him more than physical exhaustion. "Victor's forces retreated once our patrol reinforcements arrived. This time. But it was a clear message, Alara. He is done testing boundaries with notes and spies. He is beginning to test them with actual force." They walked together toward his study, and once the door closed behind them, Cale sank into his chair with a weariness that seemed to settle deep into his bones, far beyond the physical exertion of the morning's ride. Alara sat across from him, watching him carefully. The anger from their earlier argument softened considerably by the fear she had carried all morning waiting for his return. "I have been thinking," Cale said finally, not meeting her eyes, "about what happens next, and about what is fair to ask of you given everything that has already happened, and everything that still threatens to come." "What are you saying?" Alara asked, unease creeping into her chest at the careful way he was choosing his words. "I am saying that your father's debt, whatever its true origins, has already been paid many times over by everything you have endured since arriving here," Cale said, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. "I am saying that I could arrange for you to leave this fortress, quietly, to somewhere far from these territories, somewhere Victor's reach would be considerably harder to extend. I could ensure you had resources, protection, a life free from all of this, free from a debt that was never truly yours to carry in the first place. Elara stared at him, stunned by the offer, a dozen conflicting emotions rising at once. You are offering to let me go, she said slowly. I am offering you a choice, Cale said, something no one has offered you since the night those men arrived at your childhood home. Your father made a decision about your life without ever asking what you wanted. I do not intend to repeat that mistake, regardless of what it might cost me personally, to watch you walk away. The last words hung in the air between them, quiet and heavy, and Elara understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what this offer was costing him to make. Why now? She asked softly. After everything, after the investigation, after the meeting with Victor, why offer this now? Because this morning, watching my own patrol line tested by Victor's forces, I understood clearly for the first time exactly how dangerous this is about to become, Cale said, his voice rough with an honesty he rarely allowed himself. And I could not stop thinking about the possibility of something happening to you, here, because of a war that was never truly yours to fight, a debt that was never truly yours to owe. I would rather lose you to safety than risk losing you to something far worse. Elara sat in silence for a long moment, turning his offer over carefully in her mind, weighing the pull of safety, of an ordinary life free from danger, and pack politics, and men like Victor circling with patient malice, against everything else that had grown inside her over these past weeks. The trust rebuilt slowly after betrayal, the warmth she had found in unexpected conversations, the fierce, stubborn feeling that had taken root somewhere she could no longer quite locate or deny. If I leave, she said slowly, what happens to you? To this pack? To whatever conflict Victor intends to escalate? That is not your burden to carry, Cale said. It never should have been. That is not what I asked, Elara said, meeting his gaze steadily. I asked what happens to you. Cale was quiet for a long moment, something vulnerable and unguarded crossing his features before he answered. I will do what I have always done, he said. I will protect this pack. I will face Victor with whatever strength I can gather, and I will manage, as I have managed every difficulty since my mother died. But I would rather face it, knowing you are safe somewhere far from here, than face it wondering every single day whether today is the day Victor finally finds a way to reach you. Elara rose from her chair and walked slowly to the window, staring out at the training yard below, where pack members continued their exercises, despite the tension hanging over the entire fortress, life continuing stubbornly forward, even beneath the shadow of an approaching storm. She thought of her father, still sitting frozen in that chair the last time she saw him, a man who had never once asked what she wanted, who had made choices about her life as though she were simply an object to be traded away when circumstances grew difficult enough. She thought of the ordinary life waiting somewhere beyond these walls, safety and quiet and freedom from a debt that had never truly been hers. And she thought of Cale, sitting behind her now, with an offer that had clearly cost him more than he would ever fully admit, a man who had learned, over years of carrying grief alone, that protecting people sometimes meant releasing them, even when every instinct screamed to hold on tighter instead. I am not leaving, she said finally, turning back to face him. Cale's expression shifted, surprise, and something far more vulnerable, breaking briefly through his composure. Elara, you do not need to decide this quickly. Take time, think it through carefully before. I have thought about it, Elara said, crossing the room back toward him. I thought about it just now, standing at that window, and I understand exactly what leaving would mean. Safety, yes. An ordinary life, yes. But it would also mean walking away from the first place since my mother died, where I have felt like more than simply an obligation someone else has to manage. It would mean walking away from you, and from whatever this is that has grown between us, however complicated and however dangerous it has become. This is not a decision to make out of guilt or obligation or misplaced gratitude, Cale said carefully, though something hopeful had entered his voice, despite his effort to remain measured. I do not want you to stay because you feel you owe me something. I am not staying because I owe you anything, Elara said firmly. I am staying because for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I actually have a choice, and I am choosing this. I am choosing to face whatever Victor intends alongside you, rather than run somewhere safe and spend the rest of my life wondering what happened to the people I left behind." Cale rose from his chair, closing the distance between them, until they stood only inches apart, his storm-gray eyes searching hers, as though trying to confirm the sincerity of what she had just offered. "You understand what you are choosing," he said quietly. "The danger has not lessened. If anything, it will only grow more serious from here." "I understand," Alara said, "and I am choosing it anyway." Something shifted in Cale's expression then, the careful composure he wore so constantly finally softening into something raw and unguarded, gratitude, and something warmer still visible plainly in his eyes for anyone patient enough to see it. "Then we face it together," he said softly. "Whatever comes next." Outside, the afternoon light had begun shifting toward evening, and somewhere far beyond the fortress walls, along the southern border where a patrol line had been tested only hours earlier, the quiet, careful patience that had defined Victor's campaign until now had already begun giving way to something far more urgent, a decision made in a distant war room that would, within days, bring the danger circling this fortress crashing directly through its gates. The alarm bells tore through the night 3 days later, loud and relentless, and Alara woke instantly to the sound of shouting echoing through the corridors outside her room. She was on her feet before she fully understood what was happening, pulling on warm clothes with shaking hands, as the bells continued their frantic ringing, a sound she had never heard before but understood immediately, without needing anyone to explain it to her. Victor had come. She pulled open her door to find the corridor already in chaos, guards running past with weapons drawn, shouted orders echoing off the stone walls, the entire fortress transformed within moments from quiet nighttime stillness into something closer to controlled panic. She caught the arm of a passing guard, the same young man who had escorted her upstairs weeks earlier on her very first night. "Marcus," she said, recognizing him despite the chaos. "What is happening?" "Victor's forces breached the outer perimeter," he said, breathless, his expression grim. "They came through the eastern woods, avoiding the main gates entirely. The Alpha King is already at the wall. You need to get to the safe room beneath the library, now, and stay there until someone comes for you." "Where is Cale?" Alara asked, fear sharp and immediate in her chest. "Leading the defense," Marcus said. "Please, Alara, there is no time. I need to see you somewhere secure before I return to my post." She allowed him to guide her partway down the corridor, before the sound of splintering wood echoed from somewhere below, followed by shouts far too close for comfort, and Marcus's expression tightened with fresh alarm. "They should not have gotten this far inside already," he muttered, half to himself, before turning back to her. "Change of plans, this way, quickly." They had barely turned down a side corridor when 3 figures emerged from the shadows ahead, unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar colors marking their clothing, and Alara's blood ran cold as she recognized the dark green Victor's forces wore. Marcus moved instantly, placing himself between her and the intruders, but he was only 1 guard against 3, and the odds were not in his favor. "Run," he told her sharply, drawing his weapon. "Find Della. Find anyone. Just get away from here." Alara hesitated only a moment before turning and running back the way they had come, her heart pounding, the sounds of a struggle breaking out behind her filling her with a desperate fear she had not felt since the night the men first arrived at her childhood home. She rounded a corner and nearly collided with another figure, stumbling backward with a sharp gasp before recognizing Clara's frightened face. "Alara, thank the stars," Clara said, grabbing her arm. "We need to move. They are through the eastern wing already, cutting off the path to the safe room." "Marcus is fighting them, back there," Alara said, gesturing behind her. "We have to help him." "There is no time," Clara said desperately, pulling her forward. "The Alpha King ordered everyone to safety the moment the alarm sounded. We honor Marcus's sacrifice by staying alive, not by running back into danger." They moved quickly through unfamiliar passages, Clara clearly more familiar with the fortress's hidden routes than Alara had realized, ducking through a narrow servants' corridor that wound behind the main halls, avoiding the chaos still unfolding in the more visible parts of the building. But their luck ran out near a junction, where 2 more of Victor's men stood waiting, as though they had somehow anticipated exactly this route. "There she is," one of them said, a cold satisfaction entering his voice as his eyes fixed on Alara. Just as we were told. Take her. Leave the other one. Clara stepped in front of Alara instantly, fierce, despite her obvious fear. You will not touch her, she said, though her voice trembled slightly. The man laughed, low and dismissive, and moved forward with the casual confidence of someone who had never once doubted the outcome of this particular confrontation. Alara's mind raced, searching desperately for options, for anything that might change what seemed like an inevitable outcome, when her eyes fell on a heavy iron candle stand mounted against the nearby wall. She grabbed it without hesitation, swinging it hard as the man reached for Clara, catching him solidly enough to send him staggering backward with a pained shout. The second man lunged toward her immediately, and Alara barely managed to duck beneath his grasp, adrenaline overriding the fear that might otherwise have frozen her completely. Run! She shouted to Clara, who hesitated only a moment before bolting down the corridor to find help. Alara backed away from the two men, still gripping the candle stand tightly, her mind racing through everything she had ever learned about defending herself. Precious little of it, she realized with rising panic, as the recovered man advanced on her again with clear intent to end this quickly. A shape moved fast through the shadows behind him, and Alara barely had time to register what was happening before Cale appeared, moving with a speed and ferocity she had never witnessed from him before, disarming the first man in a single swift motion, before turning to face the second, with an intensity that made even Victor's trained soldiers hesitate. Get behind me, Cale said sharply, and Alara did not argue, moving quickly to press her back against the wall, as Cale dealt with the remaining threat with brutal efficiency, ensuring both intruders were subdued and disarmed within moments, guards arriving close behind him to secure them properly. Are you hurt? Cale asked immediately, turning to her, his hands moving over her shoulders and arms as though checking for injuries himself, his composed exterior completely abandoned in favor of raw, unguarded concern. I am fine, Alara said, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. Marcus, he was fighting others, back that way. He told me to run. I will send someone, Cale said immediately, calling out orders to a nearby guard, before turning his full attention back to her. Victor's forces breached further than we anticipated. This was never meant to be a simple border test. He came for you directly, Alara, exactly as he threatened at the river crossing. The sound of fighting continued somewhere in the distance, and Cale's jaw tightened with fresh urgency. I need to return to the defense, he said, but I will not leave you here unprotected again. Come with me. Stay close. And if I tell you to run, you run without question. Do you understand? Alara nodded, adrenaline and fear tangling together as she followed him through the fortress, witnessing scenes of chaos and courage in equal measure, pack members fighting fiercely to defend their home, guards falling back and regrouping, with practiced coordination that spoke to years of preparation for exactly this kind of crisis. They reached the main courtyard just as Cale's forces successfully pushed the last remaining intruders back through a breach in the eastern wall, the sounds of retreat finally beginning to replace the sounds of active conflict. Victor himself appeared briefly at the edge of the torchlight, flanked by a handful of remaining guards, his expression cold and calculating despite the clear failure of his assault. This is not over, Cale, he called across the courtyard, his voice carrying easily despite the distance. You cannot protect her forever. Sooner or later, I will find a way through that you cannot stop. You already tried, and you failed, Cale called back, stepping slightly in front of Alara despite her presence being fully visible already. Every attempt you make against her only strengthens my resolve to end whatever threat you believe you represent, permanently, the next time you cross into my territory. Victor's expression darkened, but he offered no further response, retreating into the darkness beyond the broken wall with his remaining forces, leaving behind a fortress bruised but standing, its people shaken but alive. The immediate danger passed, even as the larger threat clearly remained. In the aftermath, as guards worked to secure the breach and tend to the wounded, Alara finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened, her hands trembling as the adrenaline that had carried her through the chaos began to fade, leaving raw fear and exhaustion in its place. Cale turned to her immediately, gathering her carefully into his arms, and she allowed herself, for the first time since this entire nightmare began, to simply lean into someone else's strength, rather than carrying everything alone. You were incredibly brave tonight, Cale said quietly, his voice rough with emotions he was clearly struggling to contain. Defending yourself against armed men, with nothing more than a candle stand. I do not think I have ever been more frightened, or more proud, in my entire life. I was terrified, Ilara admitted, her voice muffled slightly against his shoulder. You did not let it stop you, Cale said. That has never once changed. From the very first night I met you, whatever fear you carry, you refuse to let it define what you do. They stood together in the torchlit courtyard as dawn began to break over the eastern hills, the fortress slowly settling from chaos into the careful, exhausted work of recovery. And Ilara understood, standing there in the safety of Cale's arms, after everything the night had demanded of her, that whatever remained of Victor's threat, whatever conflict still lay ahead, she had already proven to herself something she had needed to know since the moment those men first broke into her childhood home. She was not simply a debt to be paid or a piece to be moved across someone else's board. She was someone capable of standing her ground, of fighting for the life and the people that had somehow, against every expectation, come to matter more to her than the safety of walking away ever could. The days that followed the attack passed in a blur of careful rebuilding. The breach in the eastern wall repaired within hours by pack members who worked tirelessly, despite their own exhaustion. The wounded tended to with quiet efficiency. And Marcus, to Ilara's enormous relief, recovering steadily from injuries sustained defending her that night, injuries that could easily have been far worse. She visited him often during his recovery, grateful beyond words for his courage, and found in him a steady, quiet friendship that had solidified into something far deeper through the crucible of that terrible night. Cale, meanwhile, moved through those days with a focused intensity that Ilara had not seen from him before, meeting constantly with his advisors, sending messengers to allied territories, gathering support from packs who had watched Victor's increasingly reckless aggression with growing concern of their own. It became clear, through careful diplomacy, and the simple, undeniable fact of an unprovoked assault on neutral territory, that Victor had badly miscalculated the reaction his attack would provoke, not just from Cale, but from the wider network of packs, who valued the fragile peace Victor's ambitions now openly threatened. 3 allied packs have agreed to support a formal response, Cale told her one evening, spreading a map across his desk, careful markings indicating troop movements and strategic positions along the southern border. Victor overreached badly. An assault against a fellow Alpha's territory, particularly one that specifically targeted an unarmed civilian, has cost him allies he desperately needed to maintain his own position. What happens now? Ilara asked, studying the map with an interest that had grown naturally over these past weeks of working alongside him. Now we ensure he cannot repeat what he attempted here, Cale said. A combined force, moving within the week, enough strength that he will have no choice but to accept terms, rather than risk losing his own territory entirely. The following days brought careful preparation, and Ilara found herself included in strategic discussions, in ways that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Her insight into her father's records, and Victor's long, patient campaign, proving valuable in understanding exactly how he thought, exactly what pressures might finally force him to abandon his ambitions, rather than continue escalating them. When the combined forces finally moved against Victor's territory, the confrontation proved far less costly than anyone had feared. Faced with the reality of allied packs united against him, his own people, weary of a leader whose ambitions had brought only conflict and instability, Victor found his support crumbling faster than his pride could accept. Within days, word arrived at the fortress that Victor's own advisors had forced a resolution, stripping him of authority over the disputed southern territories, and installing leadership more interested in genuine peace than continued conquest. Victor himself, Ilara learned, had fled deeper into remote territories, rather than accept the terms his own people had negotiated, a broken and diminished figure, whose years of careful, patient scheming had ultimately cost him everything he had worked so hard to build. It was not the dramatic, decisive ending she might once have imagined, no final confrontation or triumphant battle, simply the slow, inevitable collapse of a man whose ambition had finally outpaced the loyalty and support required to sustain it. "It is over," Cale told her, when the final confirmation arrived, relief visible in his expression for the first time in what felt like months. "Victor no longer holds authority to threaten these territories, or you, ever again. Ilara felt the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally begin to lift from her shoulders, replaced by something she had not allowed herself to fully feel since the night those men first arrived at her childhood home. A genuine, cautious hope for whatever came next. "And my father's debt," she said quietly. "What becomes of that now?" Cale's expression softened, something warm and certain entering his eyes as he reached for her hand. "Your father's debt was paid the moment you chose to stay and fight for this place, for these people, for whatever exists between us, rather than accepting the safety I offered you," he said. "There is no ledger left to settle, Ilara. There never truly was, not from the moment I first asked you why you were not afraid of me, and you gave me an answer honest enough to change everything I thought I understood about my own life." Ilara felt tears finally rise, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief of an ending she had not quite dared to hope for during the darkest moments of these past weeks. "What happens now?" she asked softly, echoing the question she had asked him after the attack, though the meaning behind it had shifted entirely. "Now," Cale said, drawing her closer, his voice carrying a tenderness she had glimpsed only in rare, unguarded moments throughout their time together. "We finally have the chance to discover what this could become, without threats hanging over us, without debts or danger forcing our hand. I would like very much to spend that time with you, Ilara, if you are willing." "I am willing," she said, and meant it completely, the words carrying none of the fear or uncertainty that had shadowed nearly every moment since her old life ended, and this new, unexpected one began. "I have been willing for longer than I think either of us wanted to admit." Outside, the fortress stood quiet beneath a clear evening sky, the scars of recent conflict slowly healing alongside the fragile trust and genuine affection that had grown between a girl once sold to settle her father's debt, and a king who had learned, through her steady, fearless presence, that strength and gentleness were never truly opposites at all, but simply two halves of the same courage, waiting patiently for the right person to finally bring them together. Ilara's hands would not stop shaking as Della fastened the final clasp on her gown, and she caught her own reflection in the tall mirror, with a flicker of disbelief that this was truly happening, that in less than an hour she would stand before the entire assembled pack, before allied leaders who had traveled from distant territories, before everyone who had once looked at her with suspicion or open hostility, and stand there, not as a debt collected, but as something else entirely. "You look beautiful," Della said, meeting her eyes in the mirror with a warmth that had grown steadily since that very first tense night. "And terrified. Try to remember, the pack has already decided how they feel about you. Tonight simply makes it official." "That is somehow not as reassuring as you intended it to be," Ilara said, managing a small, nervous laugh despite the flutter of anxiety still sitting heavy in her chest. Weeks had passed since Victor's final defeat, weeks of careful healing throughout the fortress, of slowly rebuilding what conflict had damaged, and of something else entirely, a courtship neither Ilara nor Cale had ever quite planned for, growing steadily and openly between them, until even the most hesitant pack members had stopped questioning what everyone else had already accepted as simple truth. Tonight, Cale intended to make that truth formal, publicly claiming her before his people, not as payment for any debt, but as someone he had chosen freely, and who had chosen him in return. A soft knock came at the door, and Clara entered, dressed in her own formal attire, her expression bright with excitement she made no effort to hide. "Everyone is gathering in the Great Hall," she said. "Garrick has actually volunteered to help direct the seating arrangements, which I never thought I would see in my lifetime." "Garrick," Ilara repeated, surprised, despite everything she had witnessed of the man's slow, grudging shift in attitude over these past weeks, particularly after learning the full truth of how she had defended herself and Clara against Victor's men during the attack. "People change," Clara said with a small shrug, "especially when given enough reason to reconsider their assumptions. You gave this entire pack more reasons than most manage in a lifetime." Della finished the last adjustments to Ilara's gown, and together, the three women made their way toward the Great Hall, Ilara's nervousness building with every step despite the warmth and support surrounding her. She thought, as they walked, of her father, and of the letter she had sent him weeks earlier, once the immediate danger from Victor had passed. A careful, measured letter, explaining enough of what had happened to ease whatever guilt he still carried. though not enough to invite him back fully into a life she was still learning how to build for herself. His response had arrived only days ago, shorter than she expected, but carrying a sincerity she had not heard from him in years, an apology finally offered without excuses attached, and a quiet acknowledgement that whatever life she was building now, she had built it entirely through her own strength. Strength he admitted he had never given her enough credit for possessing. She had not decided yet whether to invite him into this new chapter of her life, but for the first time, she found she could think of him without the sharp, bitter anger that had defined those first terrible days after the men arrived at their door. Forgiveness, she was learning, did not require forgetting, only a willingness to let old wounds heal, at whatever pace felt honest. The great hall, when they reached its threshold, had been transformed entirely from the space Ilara remembered. Garlands of autumn flowers draped along the walls, candlelight glowing warm against polished stone, and rows of gathered guests turning as one to watch her enter, their expressions carrying none of the suspicion or hostility she had once faced, walking into that very same room as a frightened, uncertain stranger. Cale stood waiting near the hearth, dressed formally, his storm-gray eyes finding hers immediately across the crowded hall, and Ilara felt every trace of nervousness dissolve beneath the warmth and certainty radiating from his expression as she began the long walk toward him. "You came a long way," he said quietly, once she reached his side, his voice carrying just for her, despite the watching crowd, from a girl standing in a firelit room, refusing to show me any fear at all. "I told you," Ilara said softly, echoing words she had spoken that very first night. "I was still afraid. I simply refused to let it decide what I did next." "That has never once changed," Cale said, taking her hands in his, "and I do not believe it ever will." He turned then to address the gathered assembly, his voice carrying easily across the hall, steady and certain in the way she had come to associate entirely with him. "Many of you remember the night Ilara Voss arrived at these gates," he said, "brought here to settle a debt neither of us fully understood at the time. I confess, I expected very little from that arrangement, beyond a complicated obligation quickly resolved. Instead, I found someone whose courage reshaped everything I believed about strength, about fear, and about what I actually wanted from the life I had spent so long simply enduring, rather than living." Murmurs of warm agreement moved through the crowd, and Ilara felt tears rise, grateful and overwhelmed, as Cale continued. "Tonight, I claim her not as payment, not as obligation, but as my choice, made freely, and I am told, though I still find it difficult to fully believe, that she chooses this as well." He turned back to her, something achingly tender in his expression despite the formal weight of the ceremony surrounding them. "Ilara Voss, will you stand beside me? Not as a debt settled, but as the person who taught me that strength and fear can exist together, and that neither one needs to define the other?" "I will," Ilara said, her voice carrying clearly despite the tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, tears of relief and joy, rather than the fear and grief that had defined so much of her journey to this moment. The hall erupted into celebration, warm applause and genuine joy, replacing the suspicion and uncertainty that had greeted her arrival months earlier. And as Cale drew her close, sealing their promise before the assembled witness of his entire pack, Ilara allowed herself, finally and completely, to simply feel happy, without watching for danger, without bracing for the next threat, without carrying the constant weight of fear that had shadowed nearly every moment since the men first broke into her childhood home. Later, as the celebration continued around them, music and laughter filling the great hall long into the night, Cale pulled her gently toward a quiet balcony, overlooking the star-scattered hills beyond the fortress, the noise of celebration fading behind them into a comfortable, peaceful silence. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Ilara asked, leaning against the stone railing beside him. "When you asked me why I was not afraid?" "Often," Cale admitted, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. "I do not think I fully understood, until much later, that the question was never really about you. It was about me, about a life I had built entirely around inspiring fear, without ever considering what it might feel like to be met with something else instead." "And now?" Ilara asked softly. "Now," Cale said, drawing her closer as the stars stretched bright and endless above the quiet hills, I understand that the bravest thing anyone ever offered me was not fear and not submission, but honesty, freely given by someone who had every reason to hide behind whatever mask might have kept her safe, and chose instead to simply be herself. Alara rested her head against his shoulder, watching the stars in comfortable, contented silence, and thought of the frightened girl who had stood in a firelit room months earlier, uncertain of everything except her own stubborn refusal to break. That girl had survived a debt she never owed, a danger she never asked for, and a fear she had carried quietly every single day since her mother passed, learning slowly, through every difficult trial this journey had demanded of her, that courage was never truly the absence of fear at all. It was simply the choice, made again and again, to stand steady in spite of it, until finally, somewhere along that long and difficult road, standing steady had become simply who she was. And here, beneath the endless stars, beside a king who had learned to love her not, despite her honesty, but because of it, Alara Voss finally understood that she had never truly been sold at all. She had simply been found. Sleep did not come easily that night, but when it finally did, Alara found herself thinking not of the threatening note, nor of the danger still circling somewhere beyond these walls, but of the brief, unguarded moment when Cale Draven had allowed her to see, however briefly, the person hiding beneath the king. Morning arrived with a knock sharp enough to pull Alara instantly from sleep, her body tensing, before her mind had even caught up with the memory of the previous night. Della stood in the doorway when she opened it, her expression grave. "Cale asks that you join him," Della said. "The guards found something during the night search. He wanted you to hear it directly, rather than through rumor." Alara dressed quickly, and followed Della through corridors already buzzing with quiet, tense activity. Pack members gathered in small clusters, speaking in low voices that stopped abruptly whenever she passed. She found Cale in the same study where she had brought him the note the night before, standing over his desk, with two guards flanking a young man she recognized immediately, one of the kitchen staff who had served breakfast the previous morning. "Tell her what you told me," Cale said, his voice hard, controlled fury simmering just beneath the surface. The young man's eyes darted toward Alara before dropping to the floor, his hands trembling slightly, where they were bound loosely in front of him. "I did not know what the note said," he stammered. "I was told only to place it in her room, and to make it look as though the room had been searched. I was paid well for it, more money than I earn in a year of service here. I did not ask questions. I should have. I understand that now." "Paid by whom?" Alara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "A man who came through the southern trade routes 3 days ago," the young man said. "He never gave a name, but he wore Victor's colors beneath his traveling cloak. I saw them when the wind caught the fabric. I did not think it mattered at the time. I needed the money. My sister is ill, and the healer's fees." "Enough," Cale said, though something in his tone suggested less anger toward the young man now and more toward the situation itself, the desperation that had made him an easy target for exactly the kind of manipulation Victor's people seemed skilled at exploiting. "You will be dealt with according to pack law, but I want it understood that your sister's care will continue, regardless of what happens to you. I do not punish desperation the same way I punish malice." The young man's eyes widened with something like disbelieving gratitude before the guards led him away, and Cale turned to Alara once the room had emptied, his expression heavy with confirmation of everything he had suspected the night before. "So it was Victor," Alara said quietly. "It was Victor's people, at the very least," Cale confirmed, "which means he already has eyes inside this fortress, closer than I realized, and he wanted us to know it. This was not truly an attempt to harm you, Alara. It was a demonstration, a reminder that he can reach into my own household whenever he chooses, regardless of how carefully I believe I have secured it. Why would he do that? What does he actually want?" Cale moved to the window, staring out at the training yard below, where pack members had already resumed their morning exercises, despite the tension still hanging over the fortress. "Leverage," he said finally. "The same reason your father's debt found its way into my hands in the first place. Victor has spent years trying to expand his territory, and he has learned that direct conflict costs him too much. He prefers instead to create situations where his opponents are forced to make difficult choices that weaken them, regardless of which option they choose. And I am one of those situations," Alara said slowly. understanding beginning to crystallize with uncomfortable clarity. If you protect me too visibly, it costs you resources and attention he can exploit elsewhere. If you fail to protect me, it damages your reputation among your own people, who already question why a debt collection was given a place in the guest wing. You understand faster than most, Cale said, something like grim approval in his voice. Yes. That is precisely the situation he has constructed, though I confess I do not yet fully understand why he chose your father's debt specifically as the mechanism to build it. There are easier ways to create this kind of pressure than manipulating a struggling businessman's gambling losses. Elara considered this for a long moment, turning the puzzle over in her mind the way she imagined Cale himself must have been doing since the messenger's news arrived the day before. Unless my father was never simply a random target, she said slowly. Unless there was something specific about him, or about our family, that made him useful to Victor, in ways neither of us understood. Cale turned from the window to study her, something sharpening in his gaze. That is a possibility I have not yet fully explored, he admitted. It would require looking into your father's history far more carefully than I have so far, understanding exactly when and how his relationship with Victor's intermediaries began. Then let me help, Elara said immediately. Whatever this connection is, it involves my family. I have a right to understand it, and I might notice details in my father's history that would mean nothing to your investigators but everything to me. Cale hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of involving her more deeply against the value of her insight, before finally nodding. Very well, he said, but you will not act on anything you discover without bringing it to me first. Whatever this connection turns out to be, Victor has already shown he is willing to reach inside these walls to protect his interests. I will not risk you acting alone against a threat this dangerous. Agreed, Elara said, relief mixing with renewed determination. For the first time since arriving at this fortress, she felt as though she was not simply a piece being moved by forces beyond her understanding, but someone actively working to uncover the truth behind everything that had upended her life so completely. Over the following days, Elara and Cale spent long hours together, reviewing what records existed of her father's business dealings, cross-referencing dates and names against reports Cale's investigators gathered from contacts along the southern border. It was slow, careful work, and gradually, Elara found herself growing more comfortable in Cale's presence, the careful distance between them softening into something that felt, increasingly, like genuine partnership rather than the wary standoff of their first meeting. She learned, during those long hours, that Cale possessed a dry sense of humor he rarely allowed others to see, a habit of tapping his fingers against the desk when he was thinking through a difficult problem, and a patience with tedious detail that surprised her, given the fierce reputation that preceded him. He learned in turn that she asked sharp, insightful questions that often reframed problems he had been circling, without success, and that she possessed a stubborn refusal to give up on a thread of investigation once she had caught hold of it, regardless of how many dead ends it seemed to lead toward. You would have made a formidable investigator, Cale observed one evening, watching her cross-reference a set of shipping records against a timeline of her father's known financial troubles. Had circumstances been different, I mean. Had you not been born into a life that never gave you the chance to pursue something like this properly. Perhaps this is my chance, Elara said, not looking up from the papers spread across the desk between them. Strange as the circumstances are, that brought it to me. Cale was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she had learned, over these past several days, meant he was choosing his next words carefully. I find myself grateful for those circumstances, he admitted finally. Difficult as that is to say aloud, given everything they cost you. I do not think I would have crossed paths with someone like you otherwise. Elara looked up then, meeting his gaze across the cluttered desk, something warm and uncertain passing between them that neither of them seemed willing to name directly. Neither would I, she admitted softly, surprising herself with how true the words felt. The moment stretched between them, quiet and charged, until a sharp knock at the door broke the spell, and Cale's expression shifted immediately back into careful composure as a guard entered with fresh news from the southern border, news that would soon pull them both away from the careful, growing warmth of the investigation and into a confrontation neither of them could avoid much longer. Victor has confirmed the meeting, the guard said, breathless from hurrying through the fortress. 2 days from now, at the neutral grounds along the river crossing. He has requested that the girl attend as well." The warmth that had settled over the room only moments earlier vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and sharp. Cale rose from his chair so quickly it scraped hard against the stone floor. "Absolutely not," he said. "There is no reason for Alara to attend a border negotiation." "He was specific, my lord," the guard said carefully. "He said the meeting would not proceed without her presence. He implied that failure to bring her would be read as an admission that you have something to hide." Alara felt her pulse quicken, fear and determination tangling together in her chest. "I should go," she said, before Cale could argue further. "If he wants to see me, refusing will only make him more suspicious, more dangerous. I would rather face him directly than wonder for days what he intends." "You do not understand what kind of man he is," Cale said, turning to her with an intensity that startled her. "Victor does not make requests without purpose. If he wants you standing in front of him, it is because he believes it gives him some advantage, some piece of information or reaction he intends to use against us." "Then let him have his meeting," Alara said steadily, "and let him discover that whatever reaction he is hoping for, he will not find it in me." Cale studied her for a long moment, old worry and reluctant respect warring plainly across his features, before finally exhaling slowly. "If you attend," he said, "you will stay close to me at all times. You will not speak unless I indicate it is safe to do so, and the moment I signal that we are leaving, we leave, regardless of what remains unfinished in the conversation." "Agreed," Alara said, relief and apprehension mixing uneasily as the guard departed to relay their response. The 2 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Guards briefed on security arrangements, routes to the river crossing mapped and remapped for safety, and beneath it all, a tension that seemed to settle into every corner of the fortress as the meeting drew closer. Alara found herself unable to sleep properly, her mind circling endlessly around what waited for her at that neutral ground, the man whose name alone had been enough to darken Cale's expression every time it was spoken. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and overcast, gray clouds pressing low over the hills as their party set out toward the river crossing, a dozen guards surrounding the carriage that carried Alara and Cale together, tension radiating from every member of the traveling group. Cale sat across from her, dressed formally for the first time since she had arrived, dark and imposing, every inch the king his reputation described. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly as the carriage rolled steadily toward the border, "remember that you are not facing him alone. I will not allow him to harm you, regardless of what games he attempts to play." "I trust you," Alara said, and realized, with some surprise, that she meant it completely, that somewhere over these past several days, trust had grown between them, as naturally as the careful partnership they had built poring over old records together. The neutral grounds when they arrived consisted of a wide clearing beside the river, tents already erected on either side marking the boundaries each party would not cross. Victor's group had arrived first, and Alara caught her first sight of him as their carriage approached, a tall man with dark, calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them, standing at ease among his own guards, as though the entire meeting existed purely for his amusement. "Cale," Victor said as they approached, his voice smooth and unhurried. "It has been too long." "Not long enough," Cale replied, his tone flat and cold. Victor's gaze shifted to Alara, sweeping over her with an assessing interest that made her skin crawl in a way entirely different from Cale's initial scrutiny weeks earlier. "So, this is Henry Voss's daughter," he said. "Lovely. I can see why you decided to keep her close, Cale. Debts rarely arrive looking quite so interesting." "State your business, Victor," Cale said, refusing to be drawn into whatever game the other man was attempting to play. "You requested this meeting under the pretense of border matters. I assume that pretense is about to fall away." Victor's smile widened slightly, though it remained cold. "Straight to business, as always. Very well. The border matters are real, Cale, though I confess they are not the only reason I wish to see you today." His eyes returned to Alara, lingering with deliberate slowness. "Tell me, my dear, has he explained to you exactly how your father's debt found its way into his hands?" "Enough," Cale said sharply, stepping slightly in front of Alara. "Let her answer," Victor said, something dangerous entering his voice despite the pleasant tone he maintained. "I am curious whether he has been entirely honest with you, or whether he has kept certain details conveniently vague." Alara stepped forward despite Kale's protective posture, refusing to let Victor believe she needed to hide behind anyone. "I know that my father's debt was originally tangled with your territory before it reached Kale," she said evenly. "I know you have spent months testing his borders, using whatever leverage you can construct. I imagine today is simply another attempt to see how far you can push before he pushes back." Something flickered behind Victor's eyes, surprise quickly masked by amusement. "Sharp tongue for a debt payment," he said. "I begin to understand the appeal, Kale, though I wonder if she understands the full weight of what she represents, or whether you have simply been enjoying her company too much to explain it clearly." "You have 5 minutes to state actual business," Kale said, his patience visibly thinning, "or this meeting is finished." Victor's expression sharpened, the pleasant mask slipping slightly to reveal something colder beneath. "Very well," he said. "The southern territories along our shared border have grown restless under your rule, Kale. I am prepared to offer a peaceful resolution to the tensions building between us, provided you agree to certain concessions regarding trade routes and resource sharing. And if I refuse, then matters will likely become considerably less peaceful," Victor said simply. "I would hate to see conflict return to lands that have known relative calm since your mother's time, though I suppose calm has never been particularly permanent in these territories, has it?" The mention of his mother visibly tightened something in Kale's expression, and Victor's smile widened slightly, clearly satisfied at having found a wound worth pressing. Alara felt anger flare hot in her chest at the deliberate cruelty of the comment, and before she could stop herself, she spoke. "You mention his mother as though her death were simply a lesson to be exploited," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, despite the danger of speaking out of turn. "I imagine that says considerably more about the kind of leader you are than it does about anything you hope to gain from mentioning it today." Silence fell across the clearing, Victor's guards shifting uneasily, Kale turning to look at her with something between alarm and startled admiration. Victor's expression, for just a moment, lost its careful composure entirely, something genuinely furious flashing behind his dark eyes, before he mastered it once more. "You should teach your debt payment better manners, Kale," he said coldly. "She speaks for herself," Kale replied, something almost proud entering his voice despite the tension of the moment. "And she is not wrong. This meeting is finished, Victor. Send your formal terms through proper channels if you wish to discuss trade concessions. I will not stand here and allow you to use my mother's memory, or Alara's presence, as leverage in a negotiation you clearly intended to be one-sided from the start." He turned, guiding Alara firmly back toward their carriage, and Victor's voice followed them across the clearing, sharp and final. "This is not finished, Kale," he called out. "One way or another, you will learn that debts always find their way back to where they truly belong. I would hold on to her carefully if I were you. I suspect she may prove more valuable to me than you currently realize." Alara felt a chill settle deep into her bones at those final words, and glanced back once, to see Victor still watching them, his expression calculating and patient, like a man who had simply lost one small skirmish in a war he had every intention of eventually winning. As their carriage pulled away from the river crossing, Kale's jaw remained tight, with barely restrained fury, and Alara understood, with growing certainty, that whatever quiet, growing peace they had built together over these past days had just been shattered by a threat far larger and far more dangerous than either of them had fully prepared themselves to face. Neither of them spoke for a long stretch of the journey home, the carriage rattling over the uneven road, while guards rode watchfully alongside, eyes scanning the tree line, as though Victor's threat might materialize into an actual ambush at any moment. Alara watched Kale's hands, clenched tightly on his knees, knuckles pale with the effort of holding his anger in check, and found herself reaching over without fully deciding to, resting her palm gently over his. He startled slightly at the contact, glancing at her with an expression that had softened considerably from the cold fury he had worn moments earlier at the river crossing. "You should not have provoked him," he said quietly, though there was no real reproach in his voice. "What you said about my mother, it was true, and it was brave, but it was also dangerous. Victor does not forget insults easily." "I could not stay silent while he used her memory as a weapon," Alara said. "Not after everything you told me about her, not after watching you flinch when he brought her up." Kale was quiet for a moment, studying their joined hands as though uncertain what to make of the gesture, before turning his hand beneath hers, fingers curling gently around her own. "Thank you," he said softly, "for defending her, even though she was never yours to defend." "She matters to you," Elara said simply. "That makes her worth defending." The remainder of the journey passed in a silence that felt different from the tension of the ride out, something quieter and more companionable, settling between them, despite the looming threat Victor's words had left hanging over everything. By the time the fortress came into view, its familiar towers rising against the gray afternoon sky, Elara found herself thinking less about the danger that still surrounded them, and more about the warmth of Cale's hand still wrapped around her own, steady and reassuring, despite everything. Once inside the walls, Cale immediately called his advisors together, and Elara watched from a careful distance as the fortress shifted once more into a state of alert readiness. Guards doubled along the perimeter, messengers dispatched to allied territories, preparations underway for a conflict that suddenly felt far closer than it had only days before. She understood, watching him move through these preparations with practiced efficiency, that the gentle warmth of the carriage ride had already given way once more to the burdens of leadership, the careful mask of the Alpha King settling back into place as duty demanded. Later that evening, after the fortress had finally quieted somewhat, Cale found her in the library, staring at the same desk where she had first discovered the letter that started unraveling the mystery surrounding her father's debt. He sat down across from her, exhaustion visible beneath his composed exterior for the first time since she had met him. "Victor will not simply let this go," he said quietly. "Today was a test, nothing more, and I suspect we failed it in exactly the way he hoped we would." "What does that mean for what comes next?" Elara asked. "It means he will escalate," Cale said. "Perhaps not immediately, but soon. He has shown he can reach inside these walls once already. He has made it clear that he views you as valuable leverage. I would be foolish to assume today's meeting was the end of his interest in you, rather than simply the beginning of a far more dangerous campaign." Elara absorbed this, fear and determination once again warring within her chest. "Then we prepare," she said, "together. Whatever he intends, I would rather face it knowing exactly what is coming, than wait here helplessly hoping it never arrives." Cale studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his storm-gray eyes, admiration and worry, and something warmer, still tangled together in his expression. "You continue to remind me," he said quietly, "why I could not simply hand your father's debt off to someone else to collect. I do not think I have met anyone quite like you before, Elara Voss." "Is that a compliment?" she asked, a small, tired smile finally breaking through the tension of the day. "It is the truth," Cale said, "which I suspect by now you have come to appreciate far more than compliments." They sat together in comfortable silence as the candles burned low, both of them aware that whatever quiet peace remained in this moment would not last much longer. That Victor's shadow now stretched over everything, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the fragile, growing connection that had somehow taken root between a debt collector's daughter and a king who had never expected to want anything so complicated as her safety, her trust, and increasingly, her presence beside him.